Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. The Victorian family home, a spectacle of respectability, duty, and just enough repression to make Freud's ghost rub his hands together like a kid at Christmas. At first glance, it all looks picture perfect. You've got the stern but hard-working father, the demure mother in her long gown, and a cluster of children dressed like miniature adults pretending they enjoy sitting still. If you only peeked through the lace-curtained window for 5 seconds, you'd think you'd stumbled into history's most wholesome painting. But linger a little longer, and you'll realize the whole thing was less domestic bliss and more live-action horror show, disguised as a moral lesson. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Victorians were obsessed with appearances. Respectability was currency, and the family home was the most important shop window on the street. Families wanted neighbors to see order, harmony, and moral uprightness. Never mind if behind closed doors, things looked more like a Dickensian fever dream. It was in essence a circus. The ringmaster, parents who juggled societal expectations, their own ambitions, and an endless supply of rules, often enforced with a heavy hand, and the performers, children, who were expected to play their parts perfectly without ever forgetting their lines or else. What makes this double act fascinating is the contrast. On one hand, Victorians wrote endlessly about the importance of the family as the cornerstone of society. On the other, they routinely treated children like unpaid interns in the business of survival. It's the same kind of contradiction you see when someone insists they're not a morning person, while angrily demanding you respect their 5 a.m. sunrise yoga schedule. From the outside, middle and upper-class Victorian homes were shrines to order, parlor rooms polished within an inch of their lives, portraits of Queen Victoria looking down like a disapproving grandmother, and rows of obedient children lined up like moral furniture. But this wasn't just about furniture polish or stiff clothing, it was about image. A parent's reputation depended on how well their children looked and acted. If your kid coughed too loudly in church, congratulations, you'd just embarrassed the entire bloodline. Children themselves weren't so much individuals as tiny ambassadors of family honor. Imagine being 6 years old and already responsible for the PR strategy of your household. Smiling was optional, but silence was mandatory. Victorians adored the idea of angelic children in theory, but in practice angelic mostly meant sitting quietly until your legs went numb while wearing clothes that cut off circulation. And yet, it wasn't all misery, at least not from the parents' perspective. There was genuine pride in projecting the perfect family, even if achieving it often came at the expense of the kids' emotional well-being. Parents believed they were shaping their children into moral, respectable adults who would uphold Victorian values. But peel back the polished wallpaper, and the reality was often closer to a pressure cooker. A single mistake could unleash lectures about eternal damnation, parental disappointment, or worse, a stern talking to from Aunt Mildred, whose eyebrows alone could reduce a child to tears. It's worth remembering that the Victorians didn't have Instagram, so they couldn't brag about their kids online. Instead, they weaponized social interactions. Every outing was a performance. Every visit to church a chance to show off how well-behaved your little ones were. Behind closed doors, things could be tense, chaotic, or even cruel. But once the front door opened, the act resumed. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the perfect family of Britain. Part of the reason for this obsession with appearances was fear of social collapse. The Victorian era was a time of rapid change, industrialization, urbanization, scientific revolutions, and people clung to the family unit as an anchor. Parents believed strictness was the only way to prevent their children from being swallowed by the dangers of the modern world, crime, poverty, or, heaven forbid, radical ideas. Parenting wasn't just about raising kids. It was about maintaining order in a world that felt perpetually on the verge of chaos, and so the family home became a theater where ideals were acted out daily. Smiling portraits hid stern realities, Cheerful nursery rhymes often came with moralistic sermons, and that angelic child in lace probably hadn't been hugged in a week. For modern listeners, it can sound absurd, even cruel, but for Victorians, it was survival, reputation, and morality rolled into one exhausting daily performance. If you're wondering what it felt like to be a child in this setup, think of yourself as a circus acrobat forced onto the high wire without a safety net. One wobble, one slip of the tongue, and you'd fall, not into a net, but into the stern glare of a parent who believed disappointment was the sharpest tool in the parenting toolkit. The good news? You made it to adulthood. The bad news? You likely carried enough emotional baggage to fill a steamship. So as we open this series of chapters, think of the Victorian family as the greatest illusion act of the 19th century. Respectability was the mask, the home was the stage, and parenting was the trick no one wanted to admit was flawed. Welcome to the Victorian family circus, where the performers rarely smiled, the audience always judged, and the applause was replaced with silence at the dinner table. If you wanted to know how to parent like a Victorian, the easiest shortcut was simple: copy Queen Victoria. After all, she wasn't just a monarch, she was the ultimate Victorian influencer. Forget social media moms showing off homemade organic smoothies. Victoria's brand of parenting was strict discipline, emotional distance, and the occasional diary entry where she complained about how much she disliked babies. And yet somehow this became the gold standard for what good parenting should look like across Britain. Let's start with the basics. Queen Victoria had 9 children. 9, enough to form a small orchestra, a baseball team, or, in her case, a royal dynasty that she hoped would spread her genes across Europe like dandelions. You'd think with that many kids, she might have warmed up to the job. Instead, her letters and diaries often read like Yelp reviews for children written by someone who'd much rather be left alone. She described newborns as ugly, found pregnancy exhausting, and referred to motherhood as a duty rather than a joy. In one particularly charming moment, she called babies frog-like, and seemed genuinely baffled by parents who enjoyed cuddling their children. But here's the kicker. Because she was queen, her personal parenting quirks carried the weight of law in the cultural imagination. If Victoria believed affection spoiled children, then affection spoiled children. If Victoria thought discipline was the highest virtue, then discipline became gospel. The throne may not have issued parenting manuals, but her behavior trickled down to middle-class mothers eager to imitate the Queen. After all, nothing said respectable like raising your children in the style of Her Majesty, even if that style could make an ice sculpture seem warm and fuzzy by comparison. Victoria's parenting was shaped by her own experiences growing up. She had a famously strained childhood, overshadowed by her controlling mother and the notorious Sir John Conroy, who basically treated young Victoria like a puppet in waiting. When she became queen, she swore she'd never let anyone else control her again. Unfortunately, that vow translated into a parenting approach that prized authority and obedience over tenderness. Children weren't companions, they were projects. And projects in Victoria's world required strict management. Her husband, Prince Albert, only reinforced this mindset. Albert was the ultimate perfectionist. Serious, studious, and deeply committed to molding their children into shining examples of moral virtue. Between the two of them, they created a household where hugs were scarce but rules were abundant. The royal nursery operated less like a playroom and more like a training ground for future monarchs and consorts. The children were expected to sit still, recite lessons, and absorb an endless stream of instructions about decorum. The irony is that Queen Victoria did love her children, but in a distant, abstract sort of way. She loved the idea of being a mother, the dynastic pride, the continuation of the royal line, the actual practice, wiping noses, soothing tears, listening to endless questions about why the sky is blue, left her cold. She delegated most of the hands-on work to nurses, governesses, and tutors, checking in like a manager, conducting surprise inspections rather than a parent bonding with her kids. Imagine your boss telling you good job once every few weeks while docking your pay for leaving a smudge on a report. That's roughly the vibe of a Victoria-era hug. This royal model trickled down through Victorian society. Middle-class families in particular saw Victoria as a role model. If the Queen wasn't spoiling her children with affection, then neither should they. To be indulgent was to be weak. To be cold was to be strong. Parenting became less about nurturing and more about shaping children into miniature adults who could carry the weight of Victorian values without complaint. A mother's success was measured not by the warmth of her child's smile, but by the rigidity of their posture at Sunday service. Victoria's approach also reinforced strict gender roles in parenting. Mothers were tasked with discipline and duty, not comfort. Fathers remained aloof authority figures. Together they created an environment where the highest compliment for a child was being called respectable, not happy. Victorians weren't aiming for emotionally fulfilled children. They were aiming for silent, well-dressed ambassadors of family honor. Of course, the Queen's own children weren't exactly thrilled with the arrangement. Many of them grew up resentful of her coldness. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, later complained about the lack of maternal warmth in her upbringing. Prince Bertie, later Edward VII, rebelled against the strict moral training and became a bon vivant who preferred champagne and parties to piety and discipline, which proves an eternal parenting truth. The stricter you are, the more likely your kid will sneak out to invent modern clubbing. So why did this style become the blueprint for Victorian parenting? Because it fit neatly with the anxieties of the time. The Victorian era was obsessed with order, morality, and stability. Queen Victoria's parenting choices seemed to embody those ideals, even if they left a trail of emotionally neglected royal offspring in their wake. Society wasn't looking for warmth, it was looking for structure, and nothing said structure like a monarch who treated hugs like contraband. In the end, Queen Victoria's influence created a legacy of parenting that prized control over connection, duty over delight. She may have kept her household in line, but she also set a cultural precedent that turned countless homes across Britain into miniature fortresses of repression. And for generations of children, that meant growing up with fewer bedtime stories and more bedtime rules. The good news? The Queen's methods did produce a dynasty that lasted. The bad news? It also produced children who might have traded their crown jewels for a little affection. In modern times, we tend to think of children as little humans with personalities, opinions, and unfortunately the ability to scream no at the exact moment you most need them to behave. But in the Victorian era, children weren't viewed as independent people. Legally, socially, and culturally, they were closer to property, belonging to their parents in the same way one might own a nice set of silverware, a piano, or a slightly inconvenient horse. Victorian law reflected this mindset with unnerving clarity. Fathers, in particular, were considered the absolute rulers of their households. A child was not a person in their own right, but part of the father's estate, his responsibility, his burden, and when useful, his economic asset. Mothers? Well, they could nurture all they wanted, but legally speaking, they had very few rights to their children. In fact, if a couple separated, custody almost always defaulted to the father, even if he was the least qualified babysitter in Britain. Imagine today's divorce courts saying, well, Dad once remembered their birthday, so the kids are his. That was the Victorian standard. This ownership mentality bled into everyday family life. Children weren't asked what they wanted or needed, because frankly, nobody thought it mattered. They were to be molded, directed, and controlled like clay pots on the family wheel. The child's duty was to serve the family unit, not the other way around. That meant obedience was expected without question, gratitude was mandatory, and individuality was treated as a minor nuisance at best, and a punishable offense at worst. One particularly grim example of this ownership was the way children's labor was used. Parents often saw their offspring as extra pairs of hands to bring in income. Sending a child to work in a factory, mine, or field wasn't seen as cruel exploitation. It was seen as sensible resource management. The child was, after all, part of the household economy, no different from a cow that provided milk or a sewing machine that churned out clothes. If little Henry's lungs filled with coal dust, well, at least the family had supper. The legal system offered little in the way of protection. children weren't recognized as individuals with rights until much later. In fact, child protection laws didn't begin to take shape until the late 19th century, and even then, progress was sluggish. Before reforms, a parent's right to discipline or control their child often extended into outright abuse, with the courts largely uninterested, so long as the property wasn't destroyed beyond repair. The unspoken rule was, as long as the child could still function and maybe sweep a chimney, what happened at home was nobody else's business. It wasn't just the law that cemented this children as property idea, it was also cultural values. The Victorians prized hierarchy, and the family was the perfect microcosm of this worldview. At the top was the father, then the mother, then the children, and finally the family pets, who ironically sometimes received more affection than the kids. To question this order was to question society itself, and since Victorians believed that order prevented chaos, giving children autonomy felt like opening the floodgates to anarchy. A child with rights? Why, next you'd have dogs voting and women reading newspapers without permission. This lack of recognition extended to education too. Children weren't sent to school primarily for their own development, but for what their learning could contribute back to the family or society. Literacy was valued only because it created obedient, efficient workers and respectable adults. The child's imagination or emotional needs, those were luxuries dismissed as frivolity. In a way, Victorian children were like smartphones, highly useful, occasionally entertaining, but always expected to serve the owner's purpose. Perhaps the most telling feature of this worldview was how easily children could be disposed of. Unwanted children were often sent to orphanages, workhouses, or shipped overseas as part of resettlement schemes. These weren't humanitarian projects, they were ways for families and the state to reduce the burden of extra dependence. The idea that a child had intrinsic worth outside of their usefulness to adults was still a radical, almost laughable notion to many Victorians. Of course, not everyone subscribed to this cold-blooded perspective. Reformers began to argue that children deserved care, education, and even brace yourself happiness. Writers like Charles Dickens shone a harsh light on the consequences of treating children as disposable property. His novels, packed with abused or neglected orphans, forced readers to reckon with the darker side of Victorian family life. Still, change was slow, and for much of the era, the default assumption was that children existed for their parents, not with them. It's easy for us today to recoil at this attitude, but in a strange way it made sense to Victorians. The Industrial Revolution had created massive pressures on families, and survival often depended on squeezing every possible resource, including human ones. Treating children as property wasn't just a cruel quirk, it was a practical survival strategy in a society with no safety nets. The irony, of course, is that this practicality often produced more trauma than security. The good news? Families survived. The bad news? Childhood itself was collateral damage. So when we say Victorian children had few rights, we don't just mean they had fewer toys or less free time. We mean that legally, socially, and emotionally, they were viewed as possessions, a part of the household inventory, valuable for their output, but rarely cherished for their individuality. It was less, what do you want to be when you grow up, and more, here's what you'll do, and don't forget who owns the boots you're standing in. If you were a Victorian child, chances are your backside was more familiar with wooden implements than with soft cushions. The Victorians firmly believed that spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a proverb, it was a lifestyle. Discipline wasn't optional, it was the cornerstone of parenting and education. And the preferred method of instilling discipline, pain, swift, memorable, and preferably loud enough that the neighbours could hear. In homes across Britain, corporal punishment was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as love, the tough, splintery kind of love that left welts. Parents, particularly fathers, believed that physical punishment built character, instilled respect, and prepared children for the harsh realities of life. In other words, if life's going to hurt you anyway, might as well let dad get some practice in first. The tools of the trade varied. A cane was the gold standard, thin, flexible, and capable of delivering both pain and humiliation in equal measure. Belts, sticks, slippers, and even household utensils could also find themselves repurposed for discipline. One of the less glamorous duties of Victorian mothers was probably making sure the kitchen spoon was returned to the drawer after doubling as a paddle. And the ultimate punishment? The dreaded birch rod, bundles of twigs tied together, designed for maximum sting. Nothing says character building like being smacked by a small forest. Schools, of course, carried this tradition with pride. Teachers were not educators so much as disciplinarians with chalk. Classrooms were places of learning, yes, but also battlegrounds where children fought daily not to incur the wrath of the master's cane. The dunce cap is famous, but in reality, most Victorian students feared the cane far more than public humiliation. At least with a dunce cap you got to keep your circulation, and let's be clear, punishment wasn't just for serious infractions. Talking out of turn, daydreaming, slouching, dropping ink on your desk, all could earn you a sharp reminder of your responsibilities. Imagine sitting in a freezing classroom, reciting Latin declensions, when suddenly your mind wanders to lunch. Congratulations, you're about to experience why Victorians believed the buttocks were nature's whiteboard for moral instruction. The cultural logic behind all this was brutally simple. Obedience was survival. The Industrial Revolution had created a world of strict schedules, dangerous machinery, and rigid hierarchies. A child who didn't learn to obey instantly might one day disobey an overseer in a factory and end up crushed under a loom. Better to bruise a child now than bury them later. At least that's how Victorians rationalized it. Pain was framed as prevention, not punishment. Of course, to the children experiencing it, that nuance was about as comforting as a lecture on safety while being caned. What's remarkable is how cheerfully this was justified. Advice manuals and sermons of the time openly endorsed corporal punishment as a moral duty. Parents who avoided it were seen as weak or indulgent, practically inviting their children to become criminals, drunkards, or worse, French. The assumption was that without constant correction, children would descend into chaos. The cane, then, wasn't just a piece of wood. It was civilization itself, wielded by adults in the eternal war against childish mischief. And mischief could mean just about anything. Did you smile too much during prayer? That could be read as disrespect. Did you fail to memorize your times tables? Clearly a moral failing. Did you simply exist as a child in a world that didn't particularly enjoy children? Congratulations, that's punishment worthy too. The irony is that the culture of corporal punishment often produced exactly what it tried to suppress. Children became experts at deception, lying to avoid beatings, hiding misbehavior with elaborate schemes, or passing blame faster than you can say "not it." In trying to beat obedience into children, many adults instead created pint-sized Machiavellis who could outwit their parents just to avoid a whipping. It was the Victorian version of teaching kids to respect authority by accidentally training them in advanced political strategy. Of course, not every child accepted this quietly. Some grew bitter, resentful, and rebellious, carrying scars, physical and emotional, into adulthood. Accounts from later reformers suggest that many Victorians remembered their childhood punishments not as character building, but as character breaking. But since children had little say in the matter, their voices rarely shaped the conversation. Parents, teachers, and moralists controlled the narrative, and they all agreed the rod was necessary. Yet even within this era of discipline, whispers of change began to emerge. By the late 19th century, a few reformers started to question whether hitting children really produced the moral adult society claimed to want. Campaigns for child welfare and new educational philosophies began to argue for gentler methods. But these were still minority voices, often drowned out by the snap of a cane against a desk. For the majority of the Victorian era, corporal punishment remained as natural a part of childhood as learning to read, except a lot less fun and much harder to brag about. So, if you were a Victorian child, the message was clear. Your body was a chalkboard, and adults were the chalk. Every mistake left a mark, every lesson was written in pain, and every stripe was supposed to make you better. The good news? You probably learned to sit up straight. The bad news? You also learned that splinters sting, woodbends, and adults believed pain was the purest form of love. If you were a child in the Victorian era, you didn't so much grow up as you were shoved into adulthood like laundry crammed into a too small drawer. For many children, life's first milestones weren't birthdays or school plays. They were soot-filled chimneys, spinning factory machines, or the coal dust that coated everything, including their lungs. Childhood, in the modern sense, was practically a foreign concept. Instead, from the moment you could walk, you were one step closer to being drafted into the family workforce. Let's start with the mines, the most infamous of all Victorian child workplaces. Imagine being 8 years old, dragged underground before the sun even rises, and spending 12 to 14 hours hauling coal in tunnels so narrow you had to crawl on your hands and knees. These pit boys or trappers often worked in total darkness, opening and shutting ventilation doors to keep air flowing. If they nodded off or forgot, suffocation was a very real possibility. But don't worry, they were told falling asleep on the job would also earn them a beating, so at least they'd wake up long enough to be punished before suffocating. Factories weren't much better. Children worked among clattering textile machines with parts moving faster than human reflexes. Fingers were lost to gears, hair got caught in spindles, and accidents were so common that factory overseers practically considered them part of the cost of doing business. Some children were tasked with crawling under machines to sweep up cotton while they were still running. Think of it as a high-stakes game of Twister, but the losing prize was permanent injury. Then there were the chimney sweeps. These were often the youngest children, sometimes as little as 5 or 6, chosen for their small size. They were sent up narrow chimneys to scrape out soot and ash, often stripped nearly naked so their clothes wouldn't get caught. It was hot, suffocating work, and more than a few children suffocated outright in the flues. If they hesitated or got stuck, masters sometimes lit fires underneath to encourage movement. Nothing like a motivational speech, Victorian style, except it involved actual fire under your feet. Parents were often complicit in this arrangement, and not always because they were cruel. Poverty was a merciless boss, and many families relied on every possible source of income just to afford bread and rent. Sending children to work wasn't seen as neglect but necessity. A child's wage, however meager, might be the difference between survival and starvation. To Victorian logic, children weren't wasting away their youth. They were contributing to the family economy. In fact, some parents took pride in having children who could pull their weight. Childhood wasn't an age bracket. It was a probationary period before becoming a useful worker. But pride had a dark edge. In some cases, parents directly sold or apprenticed their children to employers, essentially trading their labor for a fee or promise of care. Chimney sweeps in particular were notorious for acquiring children from poor families who couldn't feed them. These arrangements blurred the line between labor and exploitation, though honestly, to the child squeezed into a soot-covered flue, there was no line at all. The hours were brutal. 12-hour shifts were common, 6 days a week. Breaks were minimal. Meals often consisted of bread crusts or thin porridge, and injuries were treated with indifference. Health consequences piled up quickly. Miners developed lung disease before they reached their teens. Factory kids lost hearing from constant noise, and chimney sweeps suffered from a distinct form of cancer caused by soot exposure. The average Victorian child worker might not have been expected to live very long, but while alive they certainly contributed to Britain's industrial boom. Consider them the unsung and unpaid heroes of empire. The irony here is rich. Victorians spoke endlessly about morality, duty, and the sanctity of family, yet thought nothing of sending their offspring into places where a rat might have had better job security. The same society that wrinkled its nose at indulgent parenting had no issue with a 10-year-old covered head to toe in soot. Children weren't pampered, they were put to work, and if they didn't survive, well, there were always more children. Families were large for a reason, and one less mouth to feed wasn't always considered a tragedy. Grim math, but it kept households afloat. Still, child labor wasn't entirely invisible. Reformers eventually took notice, horrified by the conditions. Investigations, reports, and shocking testimonies from child workers slowly began to turn the tide of public opinion. By the mid to late 19th century, new laws started limiting the hours children could work and raising the minimum working age. But enforcement was patchy, and plenty of children kept right on working because nobody was checking. Laws might say no child under 9 in factories, but if you looked small enough to crawl under a loom, guess where you were going? In the end, child labor reveals the central contradiction of Victorian parenting. Parents were told to raise moral, obedient children, while simultaneously expected to treat them like disposable cogs in the industrial machine. Love was measured in loaves of bread, not hugs, and survival outweighed sentiment. Childhood wasn't about play or learning, it was about labor. The good news? Britain industrialized faster than ever before. The bad news? It did so on the bent backs and blistered hands of children who never really had a childhood at all. If the Victorian family had a motto, it wasn't home sweet home. It was closer to children should be seen and not heard. This phrase wasn't just a polite suggestion. It was a survival strategy, a parenting philosophy, and for countless kids the soundtrack of their youth. To a Victorian parent, silence wasn't golden. It was platinum, wrapped in velvet and polished daily. The ability of children to sit quietly in a parlor without so much as sneezing too loudly was considered proof of both good breeding and good parenting. Noise equaled chaos, and chaos equaled bad parenting, and worse, gossip from the neighbors. In middle and upper class homes, this culture of silence was especially rigid. Imagine sitting in a grand parlor filled with stiff furniture, breakable ornaments, and your father reading the newspaper like a judge presiding over your every breath. Your role, as a child, was to perch politely in your miniature suit or itchy dress, hands folded, and not say a single word unless spoken to. Questions like, "Why is the dog allowed on the rug but I'm not?" or "Why does Uncle Harold smell like gin at breakfast?" were strictly off limits. Victorian children quickly learned that curiosity killed not just the cat but the child's evening privileges. The irony here is that children were praised for being angelic, but angels in Victorian homes weren't allowed to sing. Silence was the currency of respectability. If a guest commented, "My, your children are so quiet," it was one of the highest compliments a parent could receive. It meant the children weren't embarrassing the family by, say, laughing at the wrong moment or daring to have opinions. A quiet child was a well-raised child. A noisy child? That was a future criminal, revolutionary, or worst of all, an actor. This obsession with silence bled into education too. Classrooms were designed for stillness and quiet, with the teacher's voice the only acceptable sound. Speaking out of turn wasn't just rude, it was evidence of moral weakness. Victorian manuals on child rearing often warned parents not to indulge idle chatter. The idea was that too much talking wasted energy that could be better spent on moral instruction, memorizing scripture, or learning the art of not embarrassing your elders. At home, silence reinforced hierarchy. Fathers were expected to be treated like minor deities, mothers like deputy priests, and children like humble parishioners. To speak without permission was to cross a line. The dinner table in particular was an altar to silence. Meals were not opportunities for chatter but for demonstrating self-control and impeccable manners. If you were a child and dared to interrupt with, "Can I have more potatoes?" you'd likely receive a glare that could freeze soup. It wasn't just about noise, it was about erasing the child's presence. To be silent was to be invisible, and invisibility was seen as virtuous. The less space a child occupied, physically, emotionally, and audibly, the better. Parents didn't want their children disrupting their adult lives. They wanted them folded neatly into the background like wallpaper, and much like Victorian wallpaper, children were expected to endure without complaint, even if the pattern was suffocating. What makes this all the more striking is how silence was equated with worth. A quiet child wasn't just obedient, they were morally superior. The ability to suppress natural urges to laugh, question, sing, or even cry too loudly was evidence of discipline. Self-expression was seen as selfishness, while repression was a virtue. To modern ears it sounds absurd. To Victorians it sounded like order. Of course, children being children, silence wasn't always easy. Many learned to whisper conspiratorially behind closed doors, to sneak in giggles under the covers, or to invent games played entirely in mime. Siblings developed secret languages, eye signals, and other covert methods of communication. You could say Victorian children became pioneers of espionage, forced into stealth training by parents allergic to sound. The downside of this discipline of silence was profound. It stifled creativity, self-expression, and emotional connection. Children raised in this environment often grew into adults who struggled to voice feelings or opinions. Some found themselves terrified of authority figures well into adulthood, trained to keep their thoughts to themselves. The Victorian world got orderly, obedient citizens, but at the cost of silenced childhoods. Yet, in the moment parents believed they were doing their duty, a noisy household was interpreted as moral failure, a sign that children hadn't been properly trained. Silence wasn't cruelty, it was evidence of control, and control was everything. To let children chatter freely was in Victorian logic to invite disorder, disrespect, and possibly the end of civilization as they knew it. So, what did children should be seen and not heard really mean? It meant that children were decorative, like ornamental plants, pretty to look at, but God help you if they rustled too loudly in the breeze. Parents didn't want their children's voices, they wanted their presence as silent proof of their parenting success. The good news? A quiet child made for an impressive parlor display. The bad news? A generation of kids grew up knowing that their worth was measured by how effectively they could shut up. If you've ever wandered into the parenting section of a modern bookstore, you know it's a jungle. One book tells you to helicopter parent, another insists you let your child free range, and a third suggests raising them on kale smoothies and positive affirmations. Now imagine that chaos, but in the Victorian era, except instead of gentle guidance and mindfulness, the advice was more like, keep them quiet, keep them obedient, and for heaven's sake, don't let them feel anything. The Victorian period was a golden age for advice literature. Manuals, sermons, and guides flooded the market, each promising to help anxious parents raise model citizens. These weren't light reading, they were dense, moralistic tomes that treated parenting less like nurturing and more like a sacred military operation. Raising children, Victorians believed, was less about love and more about producing respectable, God-fearing adults who wouldn't embarrass the family at church. A recurring theme in these manuals was discipline, presented as the backbone of successful parenting. One widely circulated idea was that children were born inherently sinful, tiny bundles of mischief already plotting ways to undermine society. The role of parents, therefore, was not to encourage but to suppress, to stamp out selfishness, pride, or joy before they grew into rebellion. If you've ever wondered why Victorian nurseries sometimes sounded more like detention halls, this is why. Religious duty also featured heavily. Manuals warned parents that failing to instill piety in their children was not just a domestic error, but a spiritual failing. A noisy child wasn't merely inconvenient, they were flirting with eternal damnation. One popular line of reasoning went, if you didn't discipline your child, you weren't just spoiling them, you were essentially handing them over to the devil. Nothing like a little light guilt to get parents swinging the rod with renewed energy, but perhaps the most insidious tool of all was guilt itself. Victorian parenting advice didn't stop at warning parents about sin. It recommended actively cultivating guilt in children as a strategy for moral growth. Children were told to remember the sacrifices of their parents, the commandments of God, and the shame of letting anyone down. Tears weren't simply discouraged, they were weaponized. A child crying might hear, "How dare you weep after all we've done for you?" In this system, guilt wasn't just a byproduct of parenting, it was the parenting. And the manuals didn't only target children, they came for the parents too. Mothers, in particular, were bombarded with reminders of their sacred duty. Fail to discipline, and you were an indulgent ruin. Show too much affection, and you'd raise a spoiled brat unfit for society. fail to instill proper moral values, and you'd carry the blame all the way to Judgment Day. No pressure, really, just the eternal fate of your child's soul. The tone of these books ranged from stern lectures to outright threats. One might calmly explain the importance of enforcing bedtime routines. Another might warn that allowing your child to stay up late would doom them to laziness, sin, and possible criminality. A missed core wasn't an oversight, it was a gateway to a life of crime. According to the experts, letting your son skip sweeping the floor was basically preparing him to rob a bank. Of course, the experts themselves weren't always experts in any modern sense. Many were clergymen, moral philosophers, or enthusiastic amateurs who simply had strong opinions about how other people should raise their kids. Their advice was rooted less in science and more in cultural anxieties about morality, class, and the rapid social changes of the time. Industrialization, urbanization, and the breakdown of traditional communities made people nervous, and advice literature offered a comforting illusion of control. If only you followed the right rules, your child wouldn't turn into a pickpocket, a drunkard, or worse, a radical thinker. The manuals also reinforced class values. Middle-class parents, desperate to appear respectable, clung to these books as handbooks for social survival. Working-class families, meanwhile, often had less access to such literature, but still absorbed its ideas through sermons and popular culture. The result was a widespread belief that successful parenting meant strict discipline, emotional restraint, and a child who could pass as a miniature adult. Not everyone bought into it. Some reformers and progressive thinkers began to argue for gentler approaches, suggesting that love and encouragement might actually help children thrive. But such voices were drowned out by the booming chorus of manuals insisting that indulgence bred ruin. And since the manuals were often thick volumes with long titles like The Christian Mother's Guide to Raising Virtuous Offspring, the message carried the weight of both scholarship and scripture, even when it was little more than moral panic in print. The impact of this advice was profound. It shaped not just how parents acted, but how children thought about themselves. Growing up under constant reminders of sin and duty meant that many Victorian children internalized guilt as second nature. Self-expression became suspect, happiness was tinged with shame, and the safest emotional state was silent compliance. Looking back, these manuals reveal the anxieties of an era trying desperately to control the uncontrollable. Children are, by nature, unpredictable, noisy, and emotional. The Victorians responded to this chaos not with patience but with handbooks full of rules, hoping to bend human nature into neat, quiet respectability. The good news? Parents felt reassured that they were doing their duty. The bad news? Children grew up with the kind of guilt that makes modern therapy bills look like a small price to pay. If you've ever seen portraits of Victorian children, you may have wondered, wait, is that a 10-year-old or a 40-year-old banker with rickets? That's because Victorian society had a strange habit of treating children less like kids and more like undersized adults. Childhood, in the modern sense of freedom, play, and elastic waist pants, wasn't the priority. Instead, the goal was to train children to blend seamlessly into adult society. Stiff clothing, stiffer manners, and standards of decorum that even most adults failed to meet. Fashion was the first battlefield. For boys, miniature versions of men's suits were the norm. Waistcoats, collars, and jackets that looked sharp but felt like wearing a straitjacket stitched out of sandpaper. Girls often found themselves squeezed into corsets, petticoats, and dresses heavy enough to double as camping tents. Comfort was irrelevant. What mattered was presentation. A child's clothing wasn't designed for running, playing, or, God forbid, climbing a tree. It was designed for sitting still in a parlor, preferably looking like an oil painting that wouldn't embarrass the family. Corsets, in particular, carried a special cruelty for young girls. The idea of shaping the female body started shockingly early, with some children introduced to lacing before they hit adolescence. Never mind that lungs and ribs were still developing. The goal was to mold them into the image of proper femininity. Breathing comfortably was less important than projecting respectability. A young girl's posture might look impeccable, but only because she was too cinched in to slouch. If you ever wonder why Victorian portraits look so solemn, remember, smiling is hard when your internal organs are rearranging themselves. Clothing wasn't the only adult expectation. Manners were drilled into children from the moment they could stand. Boys were expected to bow properly, girls to curtsy gracefully, and both to maintain a posture that screamed dignity, even if their shoes were pinching their toes. Talking back was out of the question, but so was talking too freely. Children were encouraged to memorize scripts of polite phrases, deploy them on command, and otherwise keep their opinions neatly folded away like a handkerchief. Meals became arenas for training. Children were expected to handle cutlery with precision, chew silently, and never draw attention to themselves. Imagine being 7 years old and terrified that buttering bread incorrectly might bring eternal shame to your bloodline. Even playtime, that sacred domain of modern childhood, was often turned into practice for adulthood. Toys were miniature versions of adult tools, tiny sewing kits for girls, toy soldiers or farming sets for boys. Dolls came with moral lessons, and games were designed to teach patience and restraint rather than fun. The concept of play for play's sake was practically scandalous. This insistence on adult-like behavior came from deep cultural anxieties. The Victorians prized order and stability, and children represented the future. If you could train them early enough, you could ensure they would grow into the kinds of adults who wouldn't disrupt society with unruly behavior or revolutionary ideas. Children were not indulged, they were sculpted. And what better way to sculpt than to dress them in the literal uniforms of adulthood and demand they perform the part convincingly? Middle and upper-class families were particularly invested in this transformation. Respectability wasn't just about wealth, it was about presentation. A well-dressed, well-mannered child was proof that the family deserved its place in society. Poorer families, of course, didn't always have the luxury of miniature suits and corsets, but the expectation of children behaving like adults seeped into all levels of society. Even in humbler homes, children were often expected to adopt roles and responsibilities far beyond their years. The psychological toll was significant. Many children grew up with little room for self-expression, to laugh too loudly, to slouch, to run in the wrong place. All of it was corrected as if the child were a defective product rolling off an assembly line. Childhood became less about exploration and more about constant rehearsal for the main act of adulthood. The tragedy, of course, is that by the time these children became adults, they'd already spent years pretending to be ones. Some reformers noticed the absurdity. Critics pointed out that forcing children into adult roles robbed them of joy and stunted creativity. Writers like Lewis Carroll and J.M. Barrie, creators of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Peter Pan, offered literary escapes from the suffocating seriousness of Victorian childhood. Their works weren't just whimsical fantasies, they were quiet rebellions against a culture that demanded children grow up too fast. Alice's nonsensical adventures and Peter's refusal to grow up reflected a yearning for the very childhood freedoms the Victorian system suppressed. Still, for most Victorian kids, fantasy wasn't an option. They endured itchy collars, bone-crunching corsets, and endless lessons in etiquette. Childhood was less about mud pies and more about practicing how to shake hands without embarrassing your ancestors. The good news? If you could survive childhood as a Victorian, you entered adulthood already well-versed in decorum. The bad news? You also carried a lifelong suspicion of chairs, shoes, and breathing too loudly in polite company. If love was optional in Victorian parenting, fear was mandatory. Parents didn't just raise children, they terrified them into obedience. Forget gentle encouragement or star charts for good behavior. The Victorian reward system was simple: behave, or face eternal torment, monsters in the dark, or the kind of lecture that made you believe the wallpaper was judging you too. Fear came in many flavors, starting with the spiritual. Religion was the backbone of Victorian morality, and parents wielded it like a disciplinary hammer. Children were taught early on that God was always watching, like a celestial policeman with infinite notebooks in which to jot down their sins. A child who fibbed about stealing jam wasn't just in trouble at home, They were on a one-way path to hellfire, and Victorian descriptions of hell were not subtle. Fire, brimstone, gnashing of teeth, bedtime stories often sounded more like horror novels than comforting tales. Sweet dreams, little one, and don't forget, if you lie, demons are waiting with pitchforks. Ghost stories were another popular tactic. Parents and nurses told tales of wandering spirits, bogeymen, and malevolent figures who snatched away naughty children. The infamous bogeyman wasn't just a bedtime threat, he was a fully weaponized parenting tool. Don't want to go to bed? Better listen or the bogeyman will carry you off into the night. Don't want to finish your vegetables? Careful. The ghost of Hungry Tom might haunt you forever. Victorians didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as creative problem-solving. Why argue with your child when you can outsource discipline to a supernatural being? Moral warnings also came packaged in gruesome little morality tales. Children's literature of the time wasn't about fun adventures and cuddly animals. It was about punishment. Storybooks like Struwwelpeter, imported from Germany but wildly popular in Britain, featured children who sucked their thumbs until a man with giant scissors arrived to chop them off. Other tales depicted children who played with matches, only to burn alive and leave nothing but ashes. Lesson learned: play is dangerous, curiosity kills, and obedience is your only chance at survival. Even everyday settings were infused with warnings. Parents reminded children that misbehavior could lead to poverty, imprisonment, or death. A child who dawdled on chores might be told they'd end up in the workhouse. A child who disobeyed might be warned they'd grow up a beggar. The line between discipline and psychological scarring was thinner than a Victorian chimney sweep. Why this reliance on fear? Partly because it worked, at least in the short term. Fear produced immediate compliance. Children who thought the bogeyman was lurking outside their window were less likely to sneak out. Those who believed hell awaited liars were more likely to confess. Parents believed fear built moral character, teaching children that actions had consequences. But the consequences weren't realistic. They were exaggerated into cosmic or supernatural nightmares. It was less about teaching responsibility and more about making sure kids thought twice before breathing too loudly. There was also a cultural logic behind it. The Victorian world itself was full of uncertainty. Disease, poverty, industrial accidents, and political upheaval. Parents transferred that atmosphere of danger into child rearing. If the world was dangerous, then better to raise children who were cautious, wary, and a little bit afraid. Fear was training for life. If you could survive nightly tales of demons, you could survive a coal mine or a factory floor. But fear left marks. Many Victorian children grew up anxious, guilt-ridden, and haunted by visions of punishment far out of proportion to their mistakes. Imagine being 6 years old and genuinely convinced that forgetting to say grace before dinner would earn you eternal damnation. That wasn't a passing scare, it was a worldview. And while parents may have thought they were building obedient, moral adults, what they often produced were nervous adults who jumped at shadows and lived in quiet terror of stepping out of line. To make matters worse, children weren't allowed to question the stories. If a child asked, "Why would God punish me for spilling milk?" they weren't praised for critical thinking. They were told to hush and pray harder. Doubt was itself suspicious, questioning authority, divine or parental, was the very misbehavior these tales were designed to prevent. And so, silence and fear went hand in hand, producing children who obeyed not because they understood, but because they were too scared to ask. Not everyone approved of this fear-based parenting. Reformers like Charles Dickens, who had lived through the darker sides of childhood himself, wrote works highlighting the cruelty of scaring children into submission. Characters like Little Nell or Oliver Twist became reminders that children deserved compassion, not constant terror. Still, Dickens's novels were the exceptions in a sea of moralizing literature that insisted, "Scare them straight, or society will pay the price." The irony is that while Victorians prized logic, science, and progress in public life, their homes often ran on superstition and threats. Factories used steam engines, trains shrieked across the countryside, and yet many nurseries still relied on bogeymen to enforce bedtime. The empire ran on industry outside. But inside the home, it ran on ghost stories and hellfire sermons. The good news? Victorian parents didn't have to nag endlessly. Fear did most of the work for them. The bad news? A generation of children grew up believing bedtime wasn't about rest but about avoiding supernatural abduction. If you asked a Victorian moralist what defined the perfect mother, the answer would sound like a blend of saint and drill sergeant. She was supposed to be gentle, loving, and endlessly patient, the angel of the house radiating calm and virtue. But she was also tasked with keeping her children silent, obedient, and morally spotless. Victorian culture exalted mothers in theory, literature, sermons, and advice manuals painted them as the moral center of the household, guardians of purity, who shaped the nation's future, one child at a time. A mother was expected to inspire virtue simply by existing. Her presence was supposed to be so holy that her children naturally absorbed goodness through osmosis. No pressure, really, just the fate of Britain's moral fibre resting on your embroidery-covered shoulders. But behind this angelic ideal lay a darker reality. Mothers were also the enforcers of discipline. Fathers often remained distant authority figures, swooping in for dramatic punishments or declarations, but it was mothers who managed the daily grind of correction. They were the ones monitoring chores, silencing chatter, and delivering the constant drip of moral reminders. In other words, while fathers got to be the looming thunderclouds, mothers were the weather patterns children dealt with every day. This dual role created contradictions. On the one hand, mothers were expected to provide comfort, the warm lap, the soothing lullaby, the gentle touch. On the other, they were tasked with withholding that very comfort to avoid spoiling the child. Manuals warned that cuddling too often could corrupt a child's character, so mothers were left in the impossible position of loving their children while proving their love by not showing it. A hug might be viewed not as affection but as weakness, a slippery slope toward raising selfish little monsters. Mothers were also responsible for enforcing strict routines. Victorian households revolved around schedules, meals at precise times, prayers at set hours, lessons drilled into daily life. Mothers became the household managers, ensuring every child marched in rhythm with the family's sense of order. If something slipped, if a child dawdled, if homework was incomplete, if church shoes weren't polished, blame often landed squarely on the mother. Society judged her not just for her own behavior but for her children's. The phrase "a good mother" was less about warmth and more about how spotless her children's manners were at Sunday service. Class played a role here too. In wealthier homes, mothers often delegated the physical work of child-rearing to nannies and governesses. But delegation didn't free them from responsibility. If a child misbehaved, people didn't blame the governess. They blamed the mother for not supervising properly. Middle-class mothers, meanwhile, shouldered both the practical and moral burdens. They were expected to manage households without the same army of servants, balancing domestic labor with the constant vigilance of raising respectable children. Working-class mothers had it hardest of all, juggling jobs, poverty, and endless pregnancies while still being told that their moral duty was to raise perfect little Victorians. The pressure was immense. A mother wasn't simply raising her own child. She was raising a reflection of her husband, her household, and her class. Every mistake her child made, a tantrum, a scuffed shoe, a misplaced please, reflected back on her character. Entire reputations could hinge on a child's behavior, and it was mothers who carried that burden. The contradiction extended into cultural messaging. On one hand, poems and novels idealized mothers as gentle angels. On the other, harsh advice books told them to be firm, unyielding, and sparing with affection. The result was a constant balancing act, with mothers trying to embody two incompatible ideals: too cold, and you were a loveless tyrant; too warm, and you were corrupting your child's soul. Either way, someone would whisper about you at the next tea gathering, and the guilt, oh the guilt. Victorian mothers were marinated in it. If a child misbehaved, it wasn't the child's fault, it was the mother's failure to instill proper values. If a child grew ill, people might wonder if the mother had been careless. even when disasters were beyond her control, accidents, poverty, epidemics. The mother's competence was questioned. It was as though society handed her an impossible job and then tutted disapprovingly when she didn't achieve perfection. Of course, many mothers tried to push back in subtle ways. Some did sneak in extra affection, some shielded their children from harsher punishments, and some nurtured creativity despite the warnings of manuals. But these acts often had to be quiet, hidden, or justified as training. A bedtime story might be framed as moral instruction, even if the child enjoyed it simply as comfort. A kiss goodnight might be explained as reinforcing obedience, even if it was really love. For children, this created a confusing dynamic. Their mother was both comforter and critic, source of warmth and source of discipline. One moment she might wipe away tears, the next she might scold you for crying too long. The mixed signals could make home feel less like a refuge and more like a courtroom presided over by a judge who occasionally handed out hugs between sentences. The good news? Victorian mothers were recognized as central to the household, powerful in ways their public lives often denied them. The bad news? Their power came wrapped in impossible contradictions, leaving them to juggle angel wings and iron rods at the same time. In the Victorian family hierarchy, fathers were less like parents and more like looming statues carved from mahogany, present, commanding, and slightly terrifying, but not particularly chatty. They were the ultimate authority in the household, the last word in discipline, and the figure whose footsteps in the hallway could silence even the rowdiest children. Yet for all their power, many fathers were emotionally absent, parenting from a distance in both the literal and figurative sense. Part of this detachment came from culture. The Victorian ideal father was not meant to be affectionate or playful. He was meant to embody respectability, discipline, and control. A father wasn't supposed to roll around on the floor with his children. He was supposed to stride into the room, radiate authority, and leave everyone trembling just enough to behave better next time. The family home wasn't his playground, it was his kingdom, and he reigned with stern silence. Work played a big role in this distance. Industrialization pulled men out of the home for long hours in offices, factories, or government roles. By the time fathers returned, exhausted and soot-stained, they weren't in the mood to bond over bedtime stories. Their children often saw them less as companions and more as inspectors, popping in occasionally to assess performance. How are the children was less a question about well-being and more about whether the little ones were sufficiently obedient and tidy. This distance created a dynamic where fathers became figures of fear rather than warmth. Many children's earliest memories of their fathers weren't playful moments but punishments. If a child misbehaved, mothers might invoke the dreaded phrase, "Wait until your father gets home," at which point the atmosphere shifted instantly, like a courtroom awaiting the judge's arrival. Dad didn't need to shout. The possibility of his disappointment, or worse, his cane, was enough to keep children awake at night rehearsing their apologies. Emotional expression was not encouraged in Victorian men. Affection was viewed as weakness, and indulgence as dangerous. Fathers were expected to be pillars of strength, stoicism personified. Tears were unthinkable, laughter undignified, and hugs unnecessary. If a father did acknowledge his child with anything warmer than a curt nod, it might be remembered for years as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Imagine telling your therapist, "I know he loved me because he patted me on the head once when I was 9. Authority wasn't only about discipline inside the home, it was also about public reputation. A father's children were living testaments to his success. Obedient, well-mannered offspring reflected well on his household and his masculinity. Disorderly children suggested weakness, and weakness was intolerable in a society obsessed with order. Fathers didn't just control children because they believed it was right. They controlled them because their social standing depended on it. Respectable kids meant a respectable father, even if the respect was enforced by fear. The relationship between fathers and sons was especially complicated. Boys were seen as future men, and fathers believed it was their job to mold them into strong, hard-working citizens. But molding rarely included mentorship or affection. It meant discipline, lectures, and sometimes brutal punishment. A son might long for approval but receive only criticism, growing up with the sense that no achievement was ever quite enough. The Victorian father wasn't in the business of handing out gold stars. He was in the business of reminding you that you hadn't earned one. For daughters, the father figure was different but no less daunting. Fathers were protectors of their daughters' virtue, standing guard over their reputations with the intensity of a man guarding crown jewels. A daughter's behavior reflected directly on her father's honor, and any misstep could be catastrophic. Affection was often buried under a thick layer of vigilance. A girl might be adored, but she was also policed. The father's approval came not from love openly expressed, but from silence. A lack of reproach meant you were doing well. This isn't to say all Victorian fathers were cold tyrants. Some records show men who genuinely adored their children, who took time to play, who offered encouragement. But these were exceptions, not the cultural ideal. The stereotype of the stern, distant father dominated, reinforced by sermons, manuals, and the broader social expectation that men were to embody strength, not softness. Children often grew up with a mixture of awe and fear toward their fathers. They respected him, certainly, but closeness was rare. Many adults later recalled their fathers as remote figures, presiding over the household like monarchs whose approval was more mythical than attainable. If a father expressed pride, it was like glimpsing a solar eclipse, dazzling but fleeting, and you weren't sure you'd ever see it again. The irony is that while Victorian fathers held ultimate authority in the home, they often had very little involvement in their children's daily lives. They were rulers without intimacy, feared but not truly known. The family revolved around their authority, yet children often grew up strangers to the man in charge. Fathers were disciplinarians first, companions last, a dynamic that left its mark on generations of children who learned to equate paternal love with distance and dread. The good news? Victorian fathers taught their children respect, discipline, and how to sit very, very quietly at the dinner table. The bad news? Many of those children also grew up believing their father's lap was less accessible than the British throne. If the Victorian home was a training ground for obedience, the school was the proving ground. Forget colourful classrooms with beanbag chairs and encouragement posters. A Victorian schoolroom looked more like a factory for the mind, complete with noise, discipline, and the occasional threat of bodily harm. The purpose wasn't just to teach children reading and arithmetic, it was to hammer into them the same values enforced at home: obedience, silence, and unquestioning respect for authority. At the heart of Victorian schooling was rote memorization. Children weren't encouraged to explore ideas or ask questions. They were expected to copy, repeat, and regurgitate. Lessons were recited aloud in unison, turning classrooms into strange choirs of monotone voices, chanting multiplication tables or catechisms. Creativity wasn't just discouraged, it was considered dangerous. Why nurture imagination when you could train perfect little clerks who knew their sums and never talked back? The curriculum reflected these priorities. Reading, writing, and arithmetic formed the backbone, but they weren't taught for intellectual growth. They were taught to create useful workers and respectable citizens. History lessons focused on glorifying the nation and monarchy, instilling loyalty rather than critical thought. Religious instruction dominated much of the timetable, filling young minds with scripture and moral warnings. Geography was less about understanding the world and more about admiring the vastness of the British Empire. Every subject reinforced the same message: authority was good, questioning was bad, and then there was discipline. If you thought parental punishments were harsh, schools raised the stakes. Corporal punishment was institutionalized, with canes, straps, and rulers at the ready. Misbehavior wasn't tolerated, and misbehavior could mean anything from whispering to forgetting a spelling word. Teachers wielded punishment not just to correct, but to terrify. The classroom wasn't a place of safety. It was a place where mistakes left both intellectual and physical marks. Humiliation was another popular tactic. The infamous dunce cap wasn't just folklore. Children who failed to keep up were forced to wear pointed hats and sit in corners. publicly branded as failures. Other forms of shame included making children stand in front of the class, writing lines until their hands cramped, or sitting on special punishment stools. The goal wasn't to help struggling students, it was to warn others what happened if they dared to falter. Victorian schools also had a strong moral mission. Teachers weren't just instructors, they were moral overseers. Lessons were infused with reminders of virtue, duty, and the dangers of sin. A child who daydreamed might be accused not just of laziness, but of moral weakness. Laziness, after all, was the gateway to vice, and vice led to ruin. School wasn't just about knowledge, it was about producing good, obedient citizens who would never question their lot in life. Class mattered, of course. Wealthy children were sent to prestigious boarding schools, where discipline was mixed with academic rigor and plenty of bullying. Middle-class children attended day schools with strict regimens, often run by clergymen or ambitious educators. Working-class children, if they went to school at all, attended charity schools or ragged schools, which focused less on academics and more on basic literacy, moral instruction, and preparing them for labor. But across the board, the underlying goal was the same: conformity. The irony is that education, in theory, is supposed to liberate. In Victorian Britain, it often did the opposite. Instead of encouraging independent thought, schools stamped it out. Instead of cultivating curiosity, they rewarded obedience. The result was generations of children who learned facts and prayers by heart, but were rarely allowed to ask why. A Victorian child might know the kings of England in order, but have no idea how to question whether their life of labor and silence was fair. Still, there were small rebellions. Children whispered behind teachers' backs, carved rude messages into desks, or secretly passed notes. Some feigned illness to escape lessons. These acts of resistance, however minor, show that even in the most disciplined environments, the spark of individuality wasn't completely extinguished. But for the majority, school was less about discovery and more about survival. Surviving lessons, punishments, and the constant pressure to be respectable. By the late 19th century, reformers began pushing for broader, more humane education. The Education Acts of 1870 and beyond made schooling more accessible and emphasized literacy. Slowly, ideas of child-centered learning crept in, but for much of the Victorian period, education remained closer to indoctrination. It was about building cogs for the machine of empire, not thinkers who might challenge it. The good news? Victorian schools produced disciplined, literate citizens who could keep ledgers balanced and hymn books memorized. The bad news? They also produced adults who often carried a lifelong suspicion of classrooms, remembering school not as a place of growth but as a place of fear. If Victorian parents and teachers had a favorite seasoning for discipline, it wasn't sugar or spice, it was shame. Public humiliation was considered one of the most effective tools in the parenting arsenal. Why rely only on the sting of a cane when you could also bruise a child's dignity for good measure? To the Victorians, embarrassment wasn't just a byproduct of punishment, it was the point. Public shame was woven into the culture of both home and school. At school, the most infamous example was the dunce cap, a tall, pointed hat that marked a child as the class fool. Made to sit in the corner wearing this ridiculous cone of dishonor, the unlucky student served as a living warning to others. Did it improve academic performance? Highly doubtful. Did it give children a crash course in public ridicule? Absolutely. Few punishments were as memorable as having your peers snicker at you while your head doubled as a traffic cone. But the dunce cap was just the beginning. Children might be forced to stand for hours in front of the class, hands on their heads, while their mistakes were listed aloud. Others were made to wear signs with words like liar or thief scrawled across them, broadcasting their supposed moral failings to everyone in sight. The Victorian classroom could feel less like a place of learning and more like a medieval stockade with chalkboards. Home life wasn't much kinder. Parents used scolding as both an art form and a weapon. Private punishments often involved long, moralizing lectures delivered with all the subtlety of a fire and brimstone sermon. A child who spilled milk might not just be chastised for clumsiness. They'd be told it reflected laziness, selfishness, and possibly the decline of civilization. Imagine being 8 years old and hearing that your messy handwriting was a gateway to criminality. That was the Victorian standard. Public punishments in the home often involved shaming in front of siblings, relatives, or visitors. A misbehaving child might be made to apologize publicly, kneel for hours in a corner, or sit in silence at the dinner table while their faults were paraded aloud. The humiliation wasn't just for the child's benefit, it was for everyone watching. Other children in the room got the message loud and clear: don't be next. The philosophy behind all this was simple: shame builds character. Victorians believed embarrassment would sear lessons into a child's memory in ways kindness never could. A scolding in private was fine, but a scolding in public, that was unforgettable. And if the child's pride took a hit, well, pride was a sin anyway. Better to crush it early. Humiliation was also cheap and convenient. Physical punishments left marks and occasionally raised eyebrows from reformers, but shame left no evidence. Parents could insist they were simply teaching lessons while their child quietly internalized a lifelong fear of speaking up. The invisibility of shame made it an especially attractive tool. No bruises, no fuss, just psychological scars, gift-wrapped in moral instruction. Class colored these practices as well. Middle and upper-class families obsessed with appearances leaned heavily on shame to maintain order. A noisy child in a parlor might be scolded on the spot, ensuring that guests saw the family's commitment to discipline. Working-class families, while often relying more on direct punishment, still used shame as a quick and effective way to keep large broods in line. After all, nothing silenced a squabble faster than reminding one child loudly of the time they wet the bed last Christmas. The effects on children were predictable. Some internalized the shame, growing up timid, fearful, and hesitant to take risks. Others hardened against it, becoming defiant or resentful. But whatever the response, the memory of humiliation lingered. Adults later recalled not the details of lessons or chores, but the sting of being laughed at, the weight of scolding words, and the humiliation of being reduced to an object lesson in front of others. Literature of the time reflected this obsession with shame. Characters in Dickens' novels often endure humiliations that mirror real childhood experiences, being scolded, belittled, or made into spectacles of failure. These depictions resonated with readers because they recognized the reality. Humiliation wasn't just a plot device, it was a daily fact of life. Of course, not everyone thought public shaming was ideal. Critics argued it humiliated children without teaching them real responsibility. But for many Victorians, that wasn't the issue. They didn't want responsibility, they wanted compliance. And nothing crushed a child's spirit of rebellion faster than the knowledge that everyone in the room was watching them fail. The irony, of course, is that shame often produced the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of creating humble, obedient adults, it bred either crippling insecurity or simmering resentment. The Victorian world may have prized order, but the emotional fallout of public humiliation left many children scarred long into adulthood. The good news? A well-placed scolding or dunce cap meant your child probably wouldn't misbehave in public again anytime soon. The bad news? They also grew up with the nagging fear that every mistake would become a public spectacle, a legacy of humiliation dressed up as discipline. If Victorian parenting already seemed strict, religion came along and cranked the discipline dial to eternal consequences. Parents weren't just raising children, they were shepherding souls, with heaven or hell hanging in the balance. In this framework, disobedience wasn't merely misbehavior, it was sin. Forget leaving muddy footprints on the carpet. In Victorian thinking, a child who sassed their mother might as well have been rehearsing for eternal damnation. Religion saturated Victorian family life. Daily prayers, Sunday sermons, and constant reminders of God's watchful eye meant that children grew up under double surveillance, their parents by day, and the Almighty 24/7. God is watching you became a standard parenting line, the ultimate invisible nanny. Children were taught to believe that every fib, every tantrum, every forgotten please was being recorded in some divine ledger. one that would be reviewed at Judgment Day. Santa Claus might check his list once a year, but God's bookkeeping never stopped. The Bible itself was often wielded as both instruction manual and weapon. Verses about obedience, sin, and punishment were quoted with gusto. Honor thy father and mother wasn't just Sunday recitation. It was the cornerstone of household discipline. Religious tracts and children's books reinforced the same themes, presenting cautionary tales of wayward children whose defiance led to tragedy. If the dunce cap humiliated you in class, religious parables promised far worse, eternal fire for disobedience. Sunday was the high holy day of parenting pressure. Families paraded to church in their stiffest clothes, children expected to sit silently through sermons that often lasted hours. Fidgeting wasn't just rude, it was irreverent. A restless child in a pew wasn't merely annoying, they were seen as disrespecting God himself. Parents often reminded their offspring that angels were taking notes, as though heaven employed an army of celestial tattletales. The safest strategy for a child was to perfect the art of sitting still while trying not to sneeze too loudly. Religion also shaped what children were allowed to do outside the church. Play on Sundays was frowned upon. Joy had to be put on pause in favor of solemn reflection. Singing hymns was acceptable, playing games was not. Some children learned the hard way that even laughter could be condemned if it broke Sabbath decorum. The message was clear. Fun was dangerous unless it was dressed up in scripture. Childhood energy had to be funneled into piety, or else risk being branded sinful. Parents, particularly mothers, bore the heavy burden of transmitting this religious discipline. Manuals instructed them to train children in godliness from the earliest age. Even infants were not exempt. Some guides suggested that mothers pray aloud during feeding and diapering, ensuring holiness seeped in along with milk. By toddlerhood, children were expected to memorize prayers, hymns, and catechisms. Imagine being 3 years old and asked not only to wash your hands but also to explain original sin before supper. Fathers, meanwhile, embodied the stern, almost priestly authority of the household. Family worship often meant father reading scripture aloud, followed by commentary that doubled as a lecture on obedience. If you thought dinner table silence was intimidating, imagine dinner table sermons. Children weren't just eating potatoes, they were being fed a steady diet of fear and duty. This religious strictness blurred the line between faith and control. Genuine spirituality often mixed with a very practical desire for obedience. Fear of God became indistinguishable from fear of parents. To disobey one was, by design, to disobey the other. For children, this meant that rebellion didn't just risk punishment at home. It carried the terrifying possibility of cosmic consequences. Even the smallest acts, sneaking sweets, fibbing about chores, could feel like steps on the road to hell. The psychological impact was profound. Many Victorian children grew up equating love with judgments, reverence with fear. Their concept of God was less benevolent shepherd and more celestial headmaster with an infinite cane. The promise of heaven was dangled like a distant carrot, while hellfire loomed like a very immediate stick. Spirituality, which in other contexts might offer comfort, became a source of anxiety, another layer of pressure in a childhood already crowded with rules. Of course, not all families wielded religion with equal severity. Some parents did use faith as a source of kindness and consolation, teaching forgiveness and compassion alongside duty, but the dominant cultural narrative emphasized sin, guilt, and eternal vigilance. Reformers later criticized this approach, arguing that it produced not pious adults but fearful ones, trained to see God less as a source of hope and more as an all-seeing spy. Yet in Victorian logic, this was all necessary. The world was dangerous, temptations lurked everywhere, and children's souls were fragile. Better to raise them trembling than risk their eternal future. For parents, this wasn't cruelty, it was responsibility. And for children, it meant living with the constant sense that misbehaving at home might echo in eternity. The good news? Victorian children learned scripture by heart and rarely skipped Sunday service. The bad news? Many also grew up convinced that God and their parents were co-managers of one very stressful spiritual prison. If Victorian children weren't already burdened with silence, discipline and moral sermons, they also had the delightful bonus of questionable health care. Childhood in the Victorian era was a survival lottery. You might grow up healthy and strong, or you might succumb to measles, cholera, or the family doctor's latest experimental tonic. Parents weren't necessarily cruel, but ignorance, poverty, and a hefty dose of misplaced confidence often meant children's health needs were at best overlooked, and at worst actively sabotaged. Let's begin with diet. A modern nutritionist would probably faint at the average Victorian child's plate. Working-class families often survived on bread, porridge, potatoes, and whatever scraps they could afford. Filling, yes, but not exactly balanced. Fresh fruit and vegetables were luxuries. Meat was rare, and milk wasn't always safe to drink. Malnutrition was common, leading to rickets, stunted growth, and the kind of dental problems that made dentists rich. For middle and upper-class children, the menu looked fancier but wasn't much healthier. Rich, fatty foods dominated, sugar consumption skyrocketed thanks to empire-fueled imports, and the result was indigestion and decay dressed up in lace and satin. Medical care was another minefield. The Victorian era was a transitional moment in medicine, somewhere between leeches and actual science. Doctors were still figuring out germ theory, anesthesia was in its infancy, and antibiotics were decades away. For children, this meant that illness could be as dangerous as the so-called cures. A child with a fever might be treated with bloodletting, purging, or blistering, all of which made the poor patient feel worse, not better, even when doctors began recommending more modern treatments. Many parents stuck stubbornly to folk remedies passed down through generations. And what remedies they were. Got a cough? Here, drink this syrup laced with opium. Yes, really. Laudanum, an opium-based tincture, was widely available and given freely to children for everything from teething to restlessness. Infants were dosed with soothing syrups that contained alcohol, chloroform, or morphine. It certainly quieted the baby, mostly because the child was too sedated to cry. Modern parents fret about screen time. Victorian parents worried whether their child was still breathing after a spoonful of medicine. Other home remedies ranged from ineffective to downright harmful. Some parents swore by mustard plasters, which burned the skin to treat chest infections. Others applied leeches to reduce bad humors. Sore throats might be soothed with kerosene gargles, while constipation was tackled with doses of mercury-based purgatives. And of course, no Victorian medicine cabinet was complete without cod liver oil, a cure-all so foul-tasting that children gagged before it even touched their lips. Health in the Victorian home was less about science and more about endurance. If the illness didn't kill you, the treatment might. Hygiene was another neglected frontier. In overcrowded urban areas, families lived in cramped, damp housing with little access to clean water. Children played in streets filled with refuse, drank from contaminated pumps, and tracked home all manner of infections. Parents often didn't connect filth with disease, at least, not until cholera swept through the neighborhood. Baths were rare luxuries, toothbrushes inconsistent, and soap sometimes considered an indulgence. It wasn't that parents wanted their children sick, it was that knowledge about disease prevention hadn't caught up with reality. Vaccination was one of the few medical breakthroughs available. Smallpox inoculation became more common during the 19th century, but it was controversial. Some parents eagerly lined up their children for protection, while others resisted, suspicious of the new science or simply distrustful of government mandates. Anti-vaccination leagues sprang up, arguing that compulsory shots violated personal liberty. So while some children gained immunity, many others remained vulnerable to epidemics that continued to ravage communities. Mental health, meanwhile, barely registered on the parental radar. A child showing signs of anxiety, depression, or trauma was more likely to be scolded than comforted. Nervousness was seen as weakness. Sadness was dismissed as sulking. A child too sensitive might be ridiculed or lectured about toughness. Emotional well-being wasn't considered a health issue, it was considered character development. In the Victorian playbook, resilience was forged by enduring, not by healing. Of course, class once again shaped outcomes. Wealthier families could afford private doctors, healthier diets, and country retreats when illness struck, but even they weren't immune to medical blunders. Upper-class children might be overfed rich foods, strapped into suffocating clothing, and subjected to quack treatments advertised in glossy pamphlets. Working-class children, on the other hand, faced the compounded effects of poverty, malnutrition, overcrowding, hazardous jobs, and little medical care at all. Survival to adulthood was a triumph, not an expectation. The neglect wasn't always intentional. Many parents genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, relying on the best knowledge available to them. But the gap between good intentions and effective care was wide. Victorian parenting often confused suffering with strength, assuming that hardship would build character. Illness was sometimes treated as a test of moral fiber rather than a medical condition. The result was a generation of children who grew up tough, yes, but also undernourished, over-medicated, and haunted by the taste of cod liver oil. The good news? Victorian children who survived illness often developed iron stomachs and resilience that would carry them through adulthood. The bad news? Far too many didn't survive at all, casualties not only of disease but of neglect, ignorance, and remedies that belonged more in a chemistry lab than a nursery. For most children today, toys and playtime are synonymous with childhood. But in the Victorian world, fun was not an unalloyed good. It was suspicious, dangerous, and if indulged too freely, corrupting. Play wasn't encouraged for its own sake. It had to be justified as educational, moral, or at the very least character building. In other words, joy came with a warning label. Victorian society believed childhood should be preparation for adulthood, not a holiday from it. Idle play, they argued, was a waste of time that could have been spent memorizing scripture or practicing chores. A child chasing a hoop down the street wasn't simply exercising. They were flirting with idleness, which was considered the gateway to sin. Better to channel that energy into structured, purposeful activities than risk raising a child who thought life was supposed to be enjoyable. Toys reflected this suspicion. Many were designed less for entertainment and more for moral instruction. Dolls, for instance, weren't just companions for imaginative play. They were miniature rehearsals for domestic duty. A girl caring for her doll was practicing for future motherhood, learning the importance of nurturing and sewing tiny clothes in preparation for her adult role. Toy kitchens, sewing kits, and child-sized furniture reinforced the message play wasn't about fantasy, it was about training. Boys' toys carried a similar burden. Toy soldiers taught military discipline and loyalty to the empire. Building sets or miniature tools encouraged industriousness, preparing boys for careers in engineering, construction, or trade. Even outdoor games were framed as preparation for adulthood. Sports like cricket or football were praised not because they were fun, but because they taught teamwork, endurance, and manly self-control. If you enjoyed yourself in the process, well, that was a happy accident, not the point. Religious influence loomed large in the toy box. Some toys came packaged with moral lessons, like puzzles with biblical verses or picture books depicting the rewards of piety and the punishments of sin. Even board games weren't immune. One popular game, The Mansion of Happiness, required players to move toward heaven by practicing virtues like humility and patience, while vices like idleness or pride sent you tumbling back toward the start. Imagine trying to enjoy family game night while your pawn is condemned for sloth. Monopoly arguments look positively cheerful by comparison. For poorer children, toys were often non-existent. Play, when it happened, involved improvised objects, sticks, stones, scraps of fabric. But even then, parents and moralists frowned on too much frivolity. A child whittling a toy might be accused of wasting time better spent helping with chores. Working-class families often couldn't afford to see play as innocent fun when survival depended on labor. A child laughing in the yard might be promptly pulled inside to sweep the floor. The guilt surrounding play extended beyond toys to imagination itself. Fairy tales and fantasy stories were sometimes condemned for filling children's heads with nonsense. Serious-minded Victorians preferred literature that taught morals, duty, and piety. Stories of elves and talking animals seemed frivolous, even dangerous. What if they distracted children from their real responsibilities? A book might be tolerated if it contained a moral lesson at the end, but pure whimsy was treated as intellectual junk food. Of course, children being children, fun found a way. They whispered jokes behind adults' backs, invented games with whatever objects they could find, and carved out moments of joy in stolen recesses. Street games, despite being frowned upon, flourished. Marbles, tag, skipping rope. These games were rarely approved by adults, but they provided the unstructured play children craved. In this sense, Victorian childhood was a constant negotiation between the desire for fun and the guilt imposed by adults. The irony is that some of the most enduring symbols of Victorian childhood, dolls, rocking horses, toy soldiers, look quaint and joyful to modern eyes. But for Victorian parents, those toys weren't indulgences, they were tools, each with a lesson attached. The rocking horse trained balance and discipline, toy soldiers trained patriotism, and dolls trained domestic skills. Behind every innocent toy lurked the unspoken message, this isn't play, this is rehearsal for life. Reformers eventually began to argue that play had value in itself, that imagination and creativity were important for healthy development. Writers like Lewis Carroll and J.M. Barrie, with their fantastical tales of Wonderland and Neverland, gave children literary escapes from the relentless seriousness of their upbringing. Their works weren't just whimsical stories, they were quiet protests against the Victorian suspicion of fun. But in many homes, the guilt attached to play never really disappeared. For children, the message was clear. If you must play, do it with purpose. Make sure your doll teaches you duty, your game builds your character, and your imagination doesn't wander too far from scripture. Fun for fun's sake was risky, indulgent, and potentially sinful. The good news? Victorian toys built responsibility, skills, and discipline. The bad news? They also left generations of children wondering if laughter itself required a moral justification. In the Victorian world, not all children were created equal. From the moment of birth, a child's future was largely determined by whether they were wrapped in blue or pink, except of course those colors weren't assigned yet. Instead, society handed out invisible scripts. Boys were groomed for the public stage, girls for the private hearth. Parenting wasn't about discovering who your child might become. It was about funneling them into the narrow roles Victorian culture had already written. For boys, life was preparation for work, politics, and leadership. Their upbringing emphasized strength, independence, and the ability to contribute to the family's reputation outside the home. Fathers, when they bothered to engage, expected their sons to be tough, hard-working, and serious. Play, if allowed, was often framed as training for manhood. Cricket and football weren't just games, they were exercises in discipline, teamwork, and proving one's mettle. Toy soldiers and miniature tools reinforced the same message. Someday you will fight for the empire, or at least maintain it with steady hands and an obedient spirit. Education for boys reflected this ambition. Middle and upper-class sons were sent to schools that emphasized Latin, mathematics, and history, subjects designed to prepare them for university, law, or government service. Even when boys hated their lessons, and many did, the point wasn't enjoyment, it was preparation for a life of public contribution. Boys were expected to be visible, active, and ambitious. A respectable son was one who could uphold the family name, secure a career, and marry well enough to extend the dynasty. Girls, on the other hand, were raised in a different universe entirely. Their education, if they received one, focused less on intellectual achievement and more on domestic skills, sewing, cooking, embroidery, music, and French, because it sounded elegant at dinner parties, dominated their lessons. A girl's role was to be accomplished, not knowledgeable, polished enough to impress, but never so clever that she threatened the natural order of things. Too much ambition was unfeminine, and unfeminine was dangerous. Parenting practices reinforced this divide at every turn. Girls were constantly reminded to be modest, obedient, and self-sacrificing. They were praised for quietness, for neat stitching, for keeping their eyes lowered at the right moments. Boys were encouraged to be assertive, Girls were encouraged to be invisible. A son who shouted might be disciplined but secretly admired for his spirit. A daughter who raised her voice risked being labeled unruly, unladylike, or worse, unmarriageable. Marriage was, of course, the ultimate goal for girls. Parents raised daughters less as individuals and more as future wives and mothers. Every lesson, every chore, every expectation was geared toward that end. Daughters were trained to manage households, defer to husbands, and raise the next generation with the same values. Obedience wasn't just a childhood expectation, it was a lifelong requirement. A girl's value was measured not by her accomplishments but by her ability to attract and maintain a suitable marriage. Class shaped these gender roles in different ways. Upper-class girls were groomed for social visibility, to host salons, manage large households, and marry into alliances that secured family prestige. Middle-class girls were trained to be industrious domestic managers, proving their respectability through spotless homes and polite manners. Working-class girls, meanwhile, often had no choice but to enter the workforce as servants, seamstresses, or factory workers, but even then they were expected to return home eventually to domestic duties. No matter the class, the message was the same. A girl's sphere was the home. The inequity was glaring. Boys had at least the illusion of choice, with paths that extended into professions, politics, or exploration. Girls had one clear trajectory: marriage and motherhood. Ambitions outside that path were discouraged or outright ridiculed. A daughter who wanted to study medicine or business risked scandal, while a son who aspired to those fields was celebrated. Victorian society wasn't merely unfair, it was meticulously engineered to ensure boys carried the family name forward, while girls carried the family laundry, and yet contradictions abounded. Mothers, often tasked with enforcing these gender roles, sometimes encouraged their daughters quietly to think or dream beyond their prescribed roles. Progressive educators began to argue that girls deserved more substantial schooling. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and later campaigners for women's education chipped away at the barriers, even as mainstream parenting clung to the old scripts. But for the majority of girls, the Victorian childhood was a training camp for domesticity, with obedience drilled into them as surely as Latin was drilled into their brothers. The psychological impact was profound. Boys grew up feeling the pressure of public performance, carrying the burden of family reputation and economic success. Girls grew up with the weight of invisibility, constantly reminded that their worth lay in service, modesty, and silence. Both carried scars, but girls in particular found their individuality squeezed into corseted obedience long before they reached adulthood. The good news? Victorian parents raised boys and girls with clear expectations, leaving little confusion about what society wanted from them. The bad news? Those expectations were wildly unequal, ensuring that from cradle to marriage, gender determined destiny more than talent or desire ever could. If you've ever seen a Victorian family portrait, you might notice something missing. It's not the stiff clothing, the sepia tones, or even the occasional child looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. What's missing is warmth. Smiles are rare, embraces non-existent, and the overall impression is that these families were less about love and more about surviving a very intense etiquette class. That wasn't an accident. Many Victorian parents genuinely believed that affection, hugs, kisses, even too much verbal encouragement could ruin a child. To modern ears, this sounds bizarre. Today's parenting books stress the importance of bonding, attachment, and making sure your child knows they're loved. But the Victorians worried that too much tenderness would create weak, spoiled adults. The dominant philosophy suggested that children were born selfish and needed to be hardened into virtuous citizens. A cuddle, in this worldview, wasn't a gesture of love. It was a gateway drug to entitlement. Letters, diaries, and parenting manuals of the time reinforced this chilly outlook. Mothers were warned against overindulgence in displays of affection. Fathers were encouraged to maintain dignity and reserve rather than risk softening their authority with tenderness. The prevailing wisdom was that affection blurred boundaries, undermined discipline, and made children dependent. Better to withhold a hug now than raise a whiny adult incapable of facing life's challenges. And so, affection became rationed like sugar in wartime. A pat on the head, a rare word of praise, or an occasional smile were considered sufficient. Anything more risked tipping the balance toward indulgence. A child who received regular hugs might be suspected of growing lazy, spoiled, or even morally weak. Imagine growing up where every cuddle felt like contraband. Comforting, yes, but slightly scandalous. The irony is that many parents loved their children deeply, but cultural norms pushed them to hide that love behind a mask of sternness. They believed that true devotion meant preparing children for a harsh world, and the way to do that was by toughening them early. An affectionate parent wasn't seen as loving. They were seen as reckless, endangering their child's moral fiber with softness. Parents weren't withholding out of cruelty, they were withholding out of fear that kindness itself might damage their children. This lack of visible affection didn't mean children went untouched. Quite the opposite. Physical contact often came in the form of discipline, not comfort. A hand on the shoulder was more likely to steer you back into line than to reassure you. Physical closeness was reserved for correction, not consolation. The result was a strange imbalance. Children experienced touch as something tied to rules and punishment, not warmth and security. The suppression of affection extended beyond the home into institutions like schools and orphanages. Teachers rarely praised or comforted pupils. Doing so risked encouraging pride. Orphanage caretakers were often instructed to avoid emotional bonds with children to prevent favoritism. Affection was seen as disruptive to order. The goal wasn't to nurture individuality, but to maintain discipline, and tenderness had no place in that equation. For children, this absence of warmth could be confusing and painful. They longed for affection but were taught to interpret its absence as a sign of proper upbringing. Some grew up believing that love was supposed to feel cold and distant. Others rebelled, seeking comfort elsewhere, or clinging to friendships with a desperation that reflected what they lacked at home. Childhood, already burdened with silence and obedience, became lonelier still when comfort was withheld. Of course, not every family followed these rules to the letter. Some parents ignored the manuals and hugged their children anyway. Reformers and progressive thinkers began to argue that affection was essential to healthy development. But these were minority voices in a culture that prized restraint. Even affectionate parents often hid their warmth in private, wary of being judged indulgent by neighbors or relatives. A kiss goodnight might be given quickly, quietly, and without witnesses. The long-term effects of this cultural chill were significant. Many Victorian adults carried emotional distance into their own relationships, struggling to express love openly. The stereotype of the stiff upper lip Englishman owes much to this upbringing. Generations trained to equate affection with weakness. Emotional repression became not just a family trait, but a national identity, rooted in the belief that love, if too freely expressed, spoiled the very people it was meant to nurture. And yet, cracks in this philosophy began to appear. By the late 19th century, psychologists and reformers started questioning whether affection really did harm children. New ideas about childhood as a distinct and valuable stage of life gained traction. Slowly, the pendulum began to swing toward recognizing that hugs didn't ruin children, they helped them survive. But for many Victorians, that realization came too late, after generations had grown up starved for the very tenderness they needed most. The good news? Victorian children became masters of stoicism, able to face hardship without expecting comfort. The bad news? They also grew up believing love had to be earned through obedience and silence, a lesson that left scars as enduring as any punishment. If Victorian childhood with parents was strict, lonely, and often punishing, imagine life without parents at all. Orphans in the Victorian era didn't just fall through the cracks, they were shoved into them, sometimes deliberately. With no family to shield them, they were often left to the mercy of institutions, charities or employers who saw children less as vulnerable beings and more as opportunities for cheap labor or moral projects. The sheer number of orphans in Victorian Britain was staggering. Industrial accidents, disease outbreaks, poor sanitation, and dangerous working conditions meant that parents often didn't live long. Add in wars and widespread poverty, and entire communities produced children who had no one left to care for them. Some were truly orphaned, others were effectively abandoned, and many more had one living parent who simply couldn't afford to keep them. In Victorian logic, children without family became society's problem, and society's solutions were rarely gentle. The most common destination for orphans was the institutional orphanage. At first glance, these establishments promised safety, structure, and religious guidance, but in reality, they were often grim warehouses for children. Food was meager, clothing was second-hand, and affection was non-existent. The goal wasn't to nurture but to discipline. Orphanages prided themselves on producing obedient, pious young people who wouldn't embarrass their benefactors. The child's happiness didn't factor into the equation. Daily life in an orphanage was regimented to the minute. Rising bells at dawn, group prayers, basic lessons, and endless chores filled the day. Silence was enforced, individuality discouraged, and punishments for stepping out of line were harsh. If the Victorian family was a small training ground for obedience, the orphanage was obedience on an industrial scale. To survive, children learned quickly to suppress personality, blend in, and follow orders. Exploitation wasn't far behind. Many institutions apprenticed children out to employers, claiming it gave them useful training. In practice, it was often a convenient way to supply factories, farms, or households with free or cheap labor. Chimney sweeps, textile mills, and domestic service all relied heavily on orphan labor. For the children, apprenticeship often meant trading one institution for another, swapping the orphanage's regimentation for a master's demands. The Victorian system was less about giving children futures and more about ensuring they didn't become visible burdens. Public attitudes toward orphans were complicated. On the one hand, society pitied them. Novels like Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist tugged at middle-class heartstrings by portraying the suffering of parentless children. On the other hand, orphans were often stigmatized. Without the guiding hand of parents, they were assumed to be morally suspect, prone to laziness or crime. People feared they would grow into delinquents, making them targets for extra layers of discipline and suspicion. Sympathy existed, but it was usually accompanied by a healthy dose of judgment. Charitable organizations tried to step in, but charity always came with strings attached. Many orphanages were run by religious groups determined to mold children into paragons of virtue. Strict prayer schedules, Bible memorization, and moral lectures filled the hours. Gratitude was expected in return. An orphan who dared to complain about poor conditions risked being labeled ungrateful, a serious insult in a culture where charity was considered a gift, not a right. Some orphans didn't even make it to institutions. Street children, the ones who slipped through every safety net, lived in alleys, sold matches or newspapers, and slept wherever they could find shelter. They became the visible reminder of what happened when the system failed. To middle-class Victorians, these children were both tragic and frightening, living symbols of poverty, disease, and disorder. Efforts like ragged schools emerged to scoop them up and instill at least basic literacy and moral lessons. But these were patchwork solutions in a society overwhelmed by need. Transportation schemes offered another grim alternative. Charities and the government sometimes shipped orphans overseas to colonies like Canada or Australia, claiming they were giving children fresh opportunities. In reality, many were exploited as cheap labor on farms or in households. Families waved goodbye believing their children were bound for better lives, only to discover they'd effectively been exported as workers to foreign fields. The empire, it seemed, had uses for even its most vulnerable children. Despite these hardships, some orphans managed to thrive. Stories of resilience abound. Children who grew up in institutions, learned trades, and carved out independent lives. Dickens himself was inspired by his own experiences of neglect and hardship to expose the injustices of the system. Reformers eventually pushed for better standards, leading to more humane orphanages and child protection laws in the late 19th century. But for much of the Victorian era, Being an orphan meant facing a childhood where survival came before joy. The paradox was striking. Victorians loved to paint themselves as moral guardians of society, yet their treatment of orphans revealed how conditional that morality could be. A child with parents was expected to be obedient and silent. A child without parents was expected to be obedient, silent, and grateful, no matter how bleak their circumstances. The good news? Some orphans did find stability, education, and even success, particularly through the efforts of reformers and rare compassionate caretakers. The bad news? For countless others, the Victorian system offered little more than bare survival, leaving them to grow up in institutions that felt more like prisons than homes. If middle and upper class Victorians could at least pretend their strict parenting was about morality, working class families didn't have the luxury. For them, parenting wasn't guided by sermons, manuals, or portraits of Queen Victoria. It was dictated by poverty. The goal wasn't to raise perfect little angels. It was to keep children alive long enough to contribute to the household economy. Nurturing was a luxury few could afford. Survival was the real parenting strategy. Poverty shaped every corner of childhood. Families often lived in cramped, overcrowded housing, single rooms shared by multiple children, parents, and sometimes even boarders. Privacy was non-existent, sanitation poor, and the risks of disease constant. In such conditions, tenderness could easily take a back seat to pragmatism. A sick child might get comfort. Yes, but the family also had to calculate. Could they afford the doctor? Could they spare the time from work to care for them? Poverty turned every expression of affection into a negotiation with survival. Food was the most obvious battleground. Working-class parents wanted to feed their children well, but diets often consisted of whatever was cheapest: bread, porridge, potatoes, watered-down milk. Protein was rare, fruit and vegetables rarer. Malnutrition wasn't a moral failing. It was the inevitable result of wages that barely covered rent. Parents sometimes went hungry so their children could eat, but even then meals were meager. Dinner wasn't about bonding or table manners. It was about filling stomachs just enough to last until morning. Clothing followed the same logic. Children wore hand-me-downs until they disintegrated. Shoes were patched and repatched, sometimes so worn that children went barefoot through streets littered with refuse. Middle-class families might lecture about neatness, but working-class parents were often more concerned with making sure their children had anything at all to wear. The idea of buying a child a new outfit for comfort or style was laughable. Every penny had to stretch. Child labor loomed large in poor families' parenting choices. Sending children to work wasn't neglect, it was survival. A few extra shillings earned in a factory or as a street seller could mean the difference between paying rent or eviction. Parents often hated putting their children to work, but felt they had no choice. The home itself became an economic unit, and children were expected to contribute as soon as possible. Nurturing dreams and individuality took a back seat to keeping bread on the table. Discipline, too, was shaped by poverty. Harshness wasn't always about ideology. It was often about practicality. A single misstep could have dire consequences in a precarious world. A child playing too close to machinery, lingering too long in the streets, or neglecting chores could put the family at risk. Strict rules were survival strategies. Parents couldn't afford indulgence, and children quickly learned that obedience was less about morality and more about not getting crushed under the wheels of industry. The emotional toll of poverty-based parenting was heavy. Affection might still exist, but it was buried under exhaustion. Parents working 12-hour days in factories or as domestic servants had little energy left for play, comfort, or storytelling. Love was often expressed in sacrifices too subtle for children to notice at the time. A mother skipping a meal so her child could eat. A father patching boots late at night instead of resting. Nurture wasn't absent, but it was disguised as endurance, hidden behind fatigue and necessity. Cultural judgments made things worse. Middle and upper class reformers often looked down on poor parents, blaming them for being too harsh or too negligent. Manuals preached about morality while ignoring the reality that poverty left little room for softness. To an outsider, sending a child to work might look heartless. To the parent, it was the only way to prevent starvation. Poverty created a vicious cycle. Strict, survival-focused parenting produced children who grew up hardened, perpetuating the same practices when they became parents. Children themselves adapted in remarkable ways. Many learned resilience, responsibility, and self-reliance far earlier than their wealthier counterparts. A 10-year-old working in a factory might have contributed more to their household than a middle-class teenager memorizing Latin declensions, but this resilience came at a cost. Playtime was rare, education limited, and childhood itself truncated. Poverty didn't just shape parenting, it shortened childhood. Not all stories were bleak. Some reformers recognized the toll poverty took on families and pushed for improvements. Better housing, compulsory education, and restrictions on child labor. Slowly, these efforts chipped away at the harshest conditions. But for much of the Victorian period, poor parents did the best they could with what little they had, and what they had was rarely enough. The paradox of parenting by poverty is this: parents often loved their children fiercely, but their love was expressed through survival, not sentiment. Affection was measured in loaves of bread, patched clothes, and the ability to keep a roof overhead. Children weren't coddled or spoiled, but they were, in their parents' eyes, essential partners in the family's fight to endure. The good news? Poverty forged children who were resilient, resourceful, and tough. The bad news? It also robbed them of the softness and joy that make childhood more than just preparation for adulthood. In the Victorian era, love and hardship walked hand in hand, and too often, hardship set the pace. If you think modern parenting trends get strange, from baby sign language to debates over screen time, just wait until you hear what Victorians considered good parenting science. The 19th century was a breeding ground for bizarre theories, half-baked expert advice, and fads that blended moral anxiety with pseudoscience. Parents didn't just rely on discipline and duty. Many eagerly embraced quackery in the name of raising stronger, smarter children. Spoiler: most of these fads made childhood less joyful and occasionally more dangerous. Let's start with the Victorians' favorite science, phrenology. This now debunked practice claimed that the bumps and shapes of a person's skull revealed their character, intelligence, and moral tendencies. For parents, this meant scrutinizing their children's heads like fortune tellers reading palms. A lump here might indicate stubbornness, a ridge there might suggest laziness, and a nicely rounded forehead promised intellectual promise. Entire child-rearing strategies were built on these cranial maps. Imagine being 5 years old and having your entire future decided because Dad thought your skull suggested rebellious tendencies. Phrenology was sold as cutting-edge, blending science and morality into one neat package. In reality, it mostly provided anxious parents with excuses. A child's misbehavior wasn't due to exhaustion, hunger, or boredom. It was because their combativeness bump was too prominent. Instead of hugs or patience, children got lectures about their skulls, along with a lifelong suspicion of hats. Then there was the obsession with cold water treatments. Inspired by health reformers and various quack doctors, parents were encouraged to toughen up children with daily cold baths. The logic was simple. Warm water was indulgent, cold water built character. Babies were dunked into chilly basins, toddlers shivered through brisk scrubbings, and older children endured icy plunges, all in the name of strengthening their constitutions. Did it prevent colds? Not really. Did it make kids hate bath time with a fiery passion? Absolutely. The Victorians believed shivering produced resilience, but mostly it produced miserable, blue-lipped children who associated cleanliness with hypothermia. Strict scheduling was another fad pushed to near obsession. Influenced by manuals and so-called experts, parents were told that a child's day must be regimented down to the minute. Meals, naps, lessons, prayers, and even bowel movements were expected to follow precise timetables. A child who dawdled or deviated risked being branded as lazy or undisciplined. This rigidity gave parents the illusion of control, an antidote to the chaos children naturally bring. But it also turned childhood into a militarized timetable, with little room for spontaneity. Picture a 5-year-old being scolded not just for tantrums but for sneezing at the wrong time. Other pseudo-scientific fads veered into outright quackery. Some parents dabbled in magnetism therapy, believing that magnets placed near a child's body could improve their health or behavior. Others experimented with diets based on odd theories about humors or digestion. Blood purifiers, tonics made with questionable ingredients, were marketed as cures for everything from restlessness to bedwetting. Parents, desperate to manage their children, often bought into these promises. After all, if a syrup claimed to guarantee obedience, who wouldn't be tempted in a household already stretched thin by rules? Victorians also loved the idea of moral hygiene, which blurred physical health with character. Advice manuals insisted that cleanliness wasn't just about preventing disease, it was about virtue. A dirty child wasn't simply unhygienic, they were morally suspect. Parents were told to monitor everything from posture to handwriting as reflections of moral worth. Crooked letters suggested laziness, untidy clothes indicated sinful sloppiness, and too much laughter could imply frivolity bordering on corruption. In this framework, even brushing your teeth became a moral act. Some fads targeted emotional development in bizarre ways. For example, parents were told not to rock infants too much, since rocking might overstimulate their nervous systems. Smiling at babies too often was discouraged, lest it encourage vanity. Emotional suppression wasn't just a cultural expectation, it was framed as a medical necessity. Children raised with too much joy, the manuals warned, risked becoming unstable adults. The solution? Less cuddling, more structure, and the occasional cold bath to really drive home the point. Why did these fads catch on? The Victorian era was a time of rapid scientific discovery, but it was also an age of uncertainty. Germ theory, psychology, and modern medicine were still developing. Into that vacuum poured an avalanche of speculative theories, many dressed up as science but rooted in superstition. Anxious parents, desperate for certainty, clung to these ideas. They promised control, predictability, and a way to mold children into ideal adults. In reality, they often added layers of discomfort, fear, and guilt to already burdened childhoods. Not everyone bought in. Reformers and skeptics occasionally mocked the extremes, pointing out that skull shapes weren't destiny, and cold baths didn't guarantee moral virtue. But the allure of these fads was strong. They gave parents something tangible to do. Check a bump, enforce a schedule, dunk a child in cold water, even if those actions did little more than satisfy adult anxieties. The long-term legacy of these pseudo-scientific fads was mixed. Some children endured them and emerged tough, if resentful. Others carried scars, both physical and emotional, from treatments and routines that confused suffering with growth. Looking back, it's clear these fads say more about Victorian fears than about children's needs. They reveal a culture terrified of indulgence, obsessed with control, and willing to embrace almost any science that promised to keep children obedient. The good news? Victorian parenting produced resilient children who could survive both cold baths and moral lectures. The bad news? They also grew up with a deep suspicion of doctors, bathtubs, and anyone holding a measuring tape near their head. For every stern-faced parent insisting that silence, discipline, and cold baths built character, there were voices in the Victorian world who looked at this cultural experiment and said, "This can't be right." While the dominant narrative celebrated obedience at any cost, a growing chorus of reformers, writers, and child welfare advocates began to question whether breaking children's spirits was truly the best way to raise them. Their efforts didn't topple Victorian parenting overnight, but they planted seeds of change that would bloom in the generations to come. The loudest voice belonged to Charles Dickens. Few writers did more to expose the cruelty inflicted on children than he did. Dickens had lived through his own share of neglect and hardship, working in a blacking factory as a boy while his father languished in debtor's prison. His novels became battlegrounds where the plight of children was laid bare for all of Britain to see. Oliver Twist showed readers the horrors of orphanages and child labor. Nicholas Nickleby revealed the abuse festering in charity schools. David Copperfield drew directly from Dickens's own childhood struggles. His works weren't just stories, they were moral indictments. By turning suffering children into protagonists, Dickens forced readers to see them as human beings rather than nuisances or property. But Dickens wasn't alone. Other writers and thinkers joined in the rebellion against harsh parenting norms. Educational reformers like John Ruskin and Matthew Arnold argued that children needed more than rote memorization and punishment. They needed art, imagination, and an education that nurtured the spirit as well as the intellect. Writers like Lewis Carroll and J.M. Barrie went further, creating fantastical worlds where children weren't miniature adults but adventurers, dreamers, and heroes. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Peter Pan weren't just delightful escapism, they were subversive manifestos insisting that childhood should be whimsical, not merely preparatory. Alongside literary voices came social reformers. Campaigners like Lord Shaftesbury pushed tirelessly for child labour laws, working to reduce the brutal hours children spent in factories and mines. Philanthropists such as Thomas Barnardo established homes for orphans, attempting to replace grim institutions with environments that, at least in theory, offered care rather than mere containment. The rise of organizations like the NSPCC, National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, in the late 19th century, reflected a growing recognition that children deserved protection from abuse, a radical idea in a society that had long treated them as expendable. These reformers weren't always universally loved. Critics accused them of being sentimental, meddling, or undermining parental authority. Dickens, for example, was mocked by some for exaggerating the misery of children, as if the real problem was not child abuse, but his inconvenient insistence on pointing it out. Reformers like Shaftesbury were called idealists, accused of ignoring the economic realities that made child labor necessary. Yet their persistence slowly shifted public opinion. Even within the realm of child-rearing advice, cracks began to appear in the old certainties. Some manuals began to emphasize kindness over cruelty, suggesting that children might respond better to encouragement than constant scolding. A few brave voices argued that affection did not in fact corrupt character, and that discipline without warmth produced brittle adults. These ideas didn't overthrow the prevailing philosophy, but they introduced doubt, and doubt was a powerful start. The press also played a role. Newspapers and magazines began publishing stories that highlighted the consequences of extreme discipline and neglect. Public scandals involving child abuse cases pushed lawmakers to act, however reluctantly. Slowly, reforms chipped away at the assumption that parents had absolute power over their children. The idea that the state had a role in protecting children, once unthinkable, gained traction by the century's end. What united all these dissenting voices was a simple yet revolutionary notion. Children were people. They weren't miniature adults, they weren't property, and they weren't sinners in training whose joy had to be strangled out of them. They were individuals with needs, rights, and imaginations worth protecting. That notion, obvious to us today, was nothing short of radical in a world that treated childhood as little more than preparation for adulthood. Of course, progress was uneven. For every Barnardo home, there were still dozens of grim orphanages. For every imaginative fairy tale, there were still shelves of moralizing children's books, promising hellfire for disobedience. But the resistance mattered. It showed that even within the rigid world of Victorian parenting, empathy and imagination could not be entirely suppressed. The good news: reformers gave children a voice in a society that preferred them silent, paving the way for future protections and more humane views of childhood. The bad news: change came slowly, and for many children, Dickens' novels weren't escape fiction, they were mirrors of their own reality. Victorian Britain was a world of dizzying contrasts. On one end of the spectrum, aristocratic families raised their children in sprawling estates with tutors, governesses, and more toys than they were allowed to enjoy. On the other, working-class families crammed entire broods into one-room tenements, where children became breadwinners before they lost their baby teeth. Parenting, like everything else in the Victorian era, was divided sharply along class lines. Luxury shaped one version of childhood, survival shaped the other. For the wealthy and aristocratic, children were a kind of family investment portfolio, carefully groomed to preserve or enhance status. Parenting in these households often meant delegation. Mothers, while still expected to embody moral virtue, frequently passed daily child-rearing duties to nannies, governesses, and tutors. The result was that aristocratic children often spent more time with hired staff than with their parents. Fathers were even more distant, seeing their children primarily at formal dinners or family events, when little Edward or Charlotte would be trotted out like a prized show pony to demonstrate their progress in French or piano. Wealth meant access to better diets, safer housing, and medical attention, but it also came with crushing expectations. Upper-class boys were destined for elite schools like Eton or Harrow, where they were prepared for public life, politics, or military service. They were raised to carry the weight of family reputation and empire on their shoulders. Upper-class girls, meanwhile, were groomed for marriages that could maintain or elevate family alliances. Their education included languages, music, and etiquette, not so much to broaden their minds as to make them more marketable at dinner parties. Parenting in these homes wasn't about love or comfort, it was about producing heirs and social assets. For the working classes, parenting looked radically different. Love might have existed in abundance, but luxury did not. Survival was the priority, and children were vital contributors. By the time a child could walk, they were often expected to help around the home. By the time they were 8 or 9, many were in factories, mines, or domestic service. Parents didn't send their children to work out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Every extra pair of hands brought in wages, and those wages often spelled the difference between keeping a roof overhead or facing the workhouse. Childhood, in this context, was brutally short. Working-class parenting also meant exposure to hardship that wealthier families could insulate against. Poor diets, rampant disease, overcrowded housing, and dangerous labor environments left many children vulnerable. Parents might have wanted to nurture, but exhaustion from 12-hour workdays left little energy for tenderness. Love, when expressed, came in small, practical forms. A mother saving the last scrap of bread for her child, or a father mending shoes by candlelight. It wasn't absence of love, but love reframed by poverty. The discipline styles differed too. Wealthy children faced strict schedules, cold baths, and the pressure of high expectations. Missteps brought scoldings, humiliation, or the cane from a tutor, but rarely starvation. Working-class children, however, lived with the immediacy of consequences. Disobedience might mean injury in a factory, eviction from a rented room, or hunger at night. Rules were enforced not just to build character but to keep children alive. Even leisure reflected these divides. Aristocratic children had access to toys, tutors, and carefully supervised play, though even their play was moralized. Dolls for girls, toy soldiers for boys, chess for the precocious. Working-class children improvised games with scraps of wood or stones in the street, squeezing joy out of what little they had. Play was fleeting, often interrupted by chores or work shifts. To the upper classes, play was structured training. To the poor, it was stolen freedom. The starkest contrast came in how children were viewed as future assets. In wealthy families, children were dynastic tools. A son might inherit estates or political roles, while daughters' marriages could secure alliances. Parenting was about preparing them to maintain or elevate the family name. Among the poor, children were economic lifelines. A son's wages could keep the family fed. A daughter's service in another household might reduce the number of mouths to feed at home. Both rich and poor saw children as assets, but one measured value in titles and inheritances, the other in pennies and loaves of bread. Public perception of these groups also diverged. Wealthy parents were celebrated for producing refined offspring, even if most of the work was done by nannies. Working-class parents were often criticized as neglectful, no matter how desperately they labored to provide. A child working in a mine might spark pity from reformers, But it also sparked moral judgment. Why weren't the parents protecting them? The reality was that protection wasn't an option when rent was due and wages were low. Despite these differences, both groups shared one common flaw. Children were rarely seen as individuals with their own desires. Whether being molded into heirs or sent to work in factories, children were shaped by forces outside their control. Aristocratic children were pressured by expectations. Poor children were crushed by necessity. Both grew up under burdens designed not for their happiness but for their family's survival or prestige. The good news: wealth insulated some children from the worst dangers of poverty, while hardship bred resilience in others. The bad news: both rich and poor lost something vital in the process. For the wealthy, it was the warmth of genuine parental bonds. For the poor, it was the freedom of a true childhood. When we look back at Victorian parenting, it's tempting to breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank goodness we've moved on. No more icy baths, no more dunce caps, no more sermons about eternal fire for spilling porridge. And yet, if you listen closely, echoes of the Victorian nursery are still with us today. Modern debates about discipline, affection, and children's rights often replay old arguments dressed in new clothes. The Victorians may be gone, but their parenting ghost still haunts our playgrounds, classrooms, and dinner tables. One of the clearest legacies is the ongoing debate about discipline. Victorians equated obedience with virtue, and while the cane may be gone from most households, the question of how strict parents should be still lingers. Should children be given freedom to express themselves, or do they need firm boundaries to prepare them for life? Every time someone grumbles that kids today are too soft, they're echoing the same Victorian anxieties that once justified whippings and cold baths. The methods may differ, but the mindset that toughness equals success is straight out of the 19th century. Another inheritance is the fear of spoiling children. Victorians believed hugs and praise were dangerous luxuries. Modern parenting, thankfully, embraces affection more openly, but the suspicion still pops up. Parents worry about giving too many rewards, about raising entitled kids if they're too generous with comfort. The tension between nurturing and toughening, between cuddles and character building, is Victorian in spirit, even if today it plays out in arguments over bedtime routines instead of lectures about original sin. We also owe much of our current system of children's rights to the backlash against Victorian harshness. Campaigners who fought against child labour, abusive schools, and neglect helped pave the way for legal protections we now take for granted: compulsory education, limits on working hours, recognition that children have needs beyond obedience. The very idea that children deserve rights as individuals, not just extensions of their parents, grew out of reforms sparked by Victorian excesses. In a strange way, the cruelty of the age forced society to recognize its moral blind spots. Education reform, too, still carries Victorian fingerprints. Rote memorization and rigid timetables may sound outdated, but modern schools still wrestle with balancing discipline and creativity. Standardized testing, strict uniforms, and debates over whether schools should focus on producing workers or thinkers are echoes of Victorian classrooms, where obedience often mattered more than imagination. Whenever a child complains that school feels like prison, they're channeling a complaint their great-great-grandparents might have made, while wearing wool uniforms in a sweltering classroom. The class divide in parenting hasn't vanished either. Victorians split childhood into two categories, one shaped by luxury, the other by survival. Today, while the gulf may look different, disparities remain. Wealthier families can provide enrichment, extracurriculars, and time, while poorer families often juggle survival, schedules, and stress. The judgment persists too. Just as Victorians scolded poor parents for neglect, modern society often blames struggling families without addressing the systemic problems behind their struggles. Poverty still dictates parenting choices just as it did in Dickens' day. There's also the enduring stiff upper lip legacy. Victorian suspicion of affection and emotional expression helped shape the cultural archetype of the emotionally reserved Briton. Generations raised without open tenderness learned to equate stoicism with strength. Even today, traces of that legacy linger in families where "I'm proud of you" feels harder to say than "Did you finish your homework?" The cultural script that frowns on too much emotion has roots in nurseries where hugs were rationed like fine china. And then, of course, there's the humor. Victorian parenting, in hindsight, looks like a masterclass in overcorrection. Parents wanted silent children, obedient children, useful children, and in pursuing those goals, they often forgot that children were also human. The result was a generation that survived strictness, shame, and cold baths, but not without scars. To modern ears, many practices sound absurd. "Spare the rod? Not a chance," was a motto that now reads like the punchline to a bad joke. It's the kind of parenting that would earn a call from child services today, or at least a viral Twitter thread. Yet perhaps the biggest legacy is the reminder that parenting philosophies are never fixed. They reflect cultural fears and priorities. Victorians feared disorder, indulgence, and moral decay, so they built a system of child rearing designed to prevent chaos at all costs. We too have our anxieties about screens, nutrition, safety, and achievement, and our parenting styles will one day look just as peculiar to future generations. Maybe in 200 years, historians will chuckle at how we worried about screen time, the way Victorians worried about dolls and cold baths. The good news: we've come a long way since the Victorian era. We recognize children as individuals, value affection, and protect them from the harshest forms of exploitation. The bad news: we're still arguing over how much discipline is too much, how much freedom is enough, and whether children should be molded or allowed to bloom. The Victorians may have left their rods and dunce caps behind, but their shadow still lingers, a reminder of how easily parenting can slip from guidance into control. So next time you hear someone complain that children today have it too easy, you might smile and think, well, at least we're not dunking toddlers in cold baths or measuring their skulls for signs of laziness. Progress may be slow, but compared to the Victorian nursery, we're practically enlightened.